Hey guys, tonight we're floating into one of the weirdest cities ever built. A place so insane, so delicate, and so stubbornly brilliant, you probably won't survive this story without gasping at least once. That city is Venice. Imagine building an empire, literal palaces, cathedrals, markets and streets, on a soggy, shifting lagoon with no real land beneath your feet. Not on an island, no, on mud. Not exactly your average dream real estate. And yet, somehow, here it is, centuries later, still standing, still shimmering. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, because if you're up late with me, we're already friends. Now, or dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the 5th century, and the world is falling apart. Literally. The Western Roman Empire is cracking like an old fresco. Goths, Vandals, and all the usual suspects are flooding Italy from every direction, torching cities, looting gold, and generally being the worst Airbnb guests in history. You're a terrified Roman citizen, and you're running, far from solid ground, far from the broken roads and burning villas. You're fleeing into the sea. You find yourself standing knee-deep in salt water at the northern edge of the Adriatic, staring out at a murky maze of little islands and marshes and thinking, is this where we start over? Yep, this is where Venice begins. You and the other refugees quickly realise there's a certain genius in this miserable landscape. Sure, it's humid, and there are mosquitoes the size of your fist, but the invaders, they hate water, horses can't gallop here, and wagons sink into the sludge. The lagoon, while kind of gross, is your best defence, so you start to build. But there's a problem. There's no solid land. Just squishy mudflats, sandbars, and clumps of reed-choked islands. No problem. You gather up loads of timber from the mainland, entire forests actually, and start driving wooden stakes down through the muck, deep into the compressed clay layers below. These piles, driven at angles like a bundle of skewers, become your foundation. On top of the piles you lay wooden planks, then build stone platforms, then homes, churches, and eventually cathedrals. So the first crazy fact of Venice, it's not floating, not really. It's pinned in place like a butterfly on velvet. Beneath every building is a silent forest of wooden pilings, preserved under water where there's no oxygen to rot them. Those soggy poles, still intact today, are what make the whole thing possible. And here's your quirky fact for the night. You know how wood usually rots when wet? Well, not if it's always wet. Turns out wood submerged in an oxygen-free, salty, anaerobic environment doesn't decay, it petrifies. Venetian builders, probably through equal parts desperation and dumb luck, created the perfect conditions for a centuries-long engineering miracle. It's like they accidentally invented eternal lumber. But historians still argue over the earliest permanent structures. Some say the first real Venetian settlements weren't in Venice proper, but on nearby Torcello, Murano, or Malamocco. Others argue that the core islands of today's Venice had settlers earlier than the records admit. There's not enough archaeological evidence to settle it. All we really know, people showed up, and people stayed, because the water gave them protection, and because they were just stubborn enough to keep hammering logs into the earth until the mud held still. You build your house, then your neighbour builds hers, then someone decides there should be a bridge, then someone says, let's make it marble. Before long, what started as a clump of rickety fishermen's huts becomes something stranger, an actual city, with neighbourhoods and canals and rules. Except, it's a city that shouldn't exist. No fresh water, no farmland, no stone. Every single thing has to be imported, either floated across the lagoon or dragged through muddy channels by oxen and elbow grease. It's like playing a city builder game on hard mode with 98% of your supply chain locked. And yet, Venice doesn't just survive, it thrives. Within a few centuries it becomes one of the richest, most sophisticated cities in Europe, and it all starts here, with you, your makeshift home, and that decision to trust the swamp. But living here isn't peaceful. The tide doesn't care about your home. The sea keeps sloshing in unpredictably. Rain fills your canals. Salt water creeps into your foundation. Everything smells faintly of fish. And because you built so low, even a bad storm can turn your front yard into a bathtub. You invent words for this chaos. Words like acqua alta, high water. The early Venetians don't waste time. They reroute rivers, dam up estuaries, dig canals to redirect silt. They're not just engineers, they're eco-hackers centuries ahead of their time, manipulating the landscape to keep the city stable and dryish. It's an arms race against nature, and spoiler, nature never really stops winning. But for now, you're holding the line. And slowly, something almost magical happens. The city, hemmed in by water, develops in a completely different rhythm than everywhere else. There are no horses, no carts, no straight roads. Everything is twisted, curving, narrow. The alleys feel like whispers. The city begins to breathe like a labyrinth, each canal reflecting the sky like a moving mirror. You still remember the first time you see a gondola glide by. It's not yet the tourist cliché it will become. Right now, it's just transport. A sleek, flat-bottomed boat designed to skim across shallow canals with barely a ripple. The silence of it, the grace, it's unreal. The boatman doesn't need roads or reins, just a long oar, a steady hand, and a lifetime of practice. The city moves at the pace of water, and somehow that feels just right. So here you are, living on logs, surrounded by waves, building a city that logic says should sink at any moment. You're not supposed to be here, but you are, and you're just getting started. Morning hits the lagoon with a kind of milky glow, the kind that makes the sky and water blur into one long silver sheet. You're up early because you heard something strange last night. Creaking, groaning, a sound like the earth itself letting out a sigh. For a terrifying second you thought your house was finally sinking. It wasn't, but it could have been. That's the unsettling part about life in Venice. You're constantly aware that your home is perched on a bizarre experiment, one where the building materials shouldn't last as long as they have. So naturally you start asking questions. Why hasn't everything fallen over yet? Turns out it's the wood, or more specifically, how the wood interacts with the mud and water underneath. Remember those wooden piles you drove into the lagoon? They're still there. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of them under every building. Oak, larch and alder mostly, dense hardwoods hauled across northern Italy in staggering quantities. At first glance it seems like a ridiculous idea. Build an entire city on wood submerged in brackish water. But here's the trick. Wood only rots when exposed to oxygen. The bottom of the Venetian lagoon? Not exactly a well-ventilated space. It's cold, it's wet, and it's practically an anaerobic time capsule. So instead of decaying, the wood stays preserved. Better than preserved, it mineralizes. Over time, the silt and water harden the fibres, turning the piles into a sort of half-organic, half-stone hybrid. Engineers will later call it petrification, though that makes it sound more magical than it is. Still, you can't help but feel it's a little magical. The entire city is literally standing on fossilized trees. And this wasn't a quick weekend project either. The sheer scale of it is wild. Some of the larger buildings, like the famous Cadoro or Santa Maria della Salute, rest on something like 1 million wooden piles each. It's like Venice isn't just floating, it's being held in place by ancient forests you can't see. Now for the quirky bit. Ready for this? Venice, the city on stilts, is made mostly from imported stone, from Istria. That's right. The gorgeous white limestone you see everywhere, the bridges, the palaces, the cathedral facades, didn't come from Italy. It came from across the Adriatic Sea. Why? Because Istrian limestone is dense, non-porous, and holds up beautifully in salty air. The Venetians thought, well, if we're already building on logs, why not make it fancy? So they lugged tons of this stone over on flat-bottom barges, building this gleaming city one waterlogged shipment at a time. And yet, even with all this effort, it's not perfect. Things still shift, slowly, subtly. If you look closely at some of the oldest buildings, you'll see that they lean, not dramatically, but enough to give them character. Foundations settle. Wood piles press deeper into the mud. Brick facades buckle just a bit over the centuries. But instead of collapsing, the city bends. It creaks and settles and survives. Of course, not everyone agrees why it survives so well. There's still scholarly debate over how much of the preservation is thanks to the lagoon's chemistry versus the original engineering. Some say it's the mineral-rich silt. Others claim it's the tidal motion that flushes the water and keeps the piles stable. A few even suggest that the Romans had some secret wood treatment technique we just haven't rediscovered yet. It's one of those debates that keeps archaeologists arguing well past midnight, usually over wine. You, meanwhile, are walking across one of the oldest neighbourhoods in the city, Dorsoduro, where you can really see the original engineering up close. Narrow alleys hemmed in by 4-storey homes, stone arches that seem impossibly delicate, and always the sound of water lapping against brick. You stop and kneel beside a canal wall, running your fingers over the lowest layer of stone. It's smooth, almost too smooth, like it's been worn down by centuries of tide and time. Above it, the bricks start, small, red, and slightly misshapen. Handmade, baked in distant kilns, carted over in boats. It hits you just how manual this all was. No cranes, no cement mixers, just manpower, clever rigging, and boatloads of determination. Even draining parts of the lagoon took ingenuity. The Venetians constructed artificial islands by piling up sand and gravel over their wooden platforms. They redirected rivers like the Brenta to prevent silt from clogging the lagoon. Basically, they looked at nature and said, "Cool story, but we're going to do it our way." And speaking of nature, there's a weird little creature that lives under Venice most people don't talk about. Shipworms. Well, technically they're not worms, they're mollusks, and they love to chew through submerged wood like it's a buffet. In most coastal cities, these things would be a nightmare, slowly devouring docks and piers from the inside. But in Venice, not a huge issue. Why? Because the lagoon's brackish water, half salt, half fresh, confuses the shipworms. They don't thrive here. Another accidental win for the Venetian ecosystem. Still, the threat was real enough that the city had to develop a whole maintenance culture around its foundations. Every few decades, some poor soul has to dive beneath the buildings and check the pilings. It's cold, dark, and filled with debris. No visibility. You can only feel your way through centuries-old structures, praying you don't disturb anything that'll bring a palace down on your head. And if that job sounds horrifying, it is. But without those unsung divers, a lot more of Venice would have crumbled. You keep walking, ducking through an archway into a tiny courtyard. Laundry flaps overhead. A cat sprawls on a sun-warmed step. Someone singing 2 floors up, the voice curling down toward the bricks like steam. It's a reminder that, underneath all this ancient engineering, real life goes on. People are born here. They fall in love. They eat questionable seafood. They grow old in buildings that would collapse anywhere else. And yet the whole thing holds, day after day, tide after tide. Maybe that's the wildest engineering of all. Not the wood, not the limestone, not the sheer cleverness of building in a swamp, but the fact that, over centuries, people kept choosing to stay, to repair instead of abandon, to add another layer of stone on top of the last. Venice didn't just happen, it was fought for. It still is. You take one last look at the edge of a canal before turning toward the Grand Canal, where the water glimmers like a broken mirror and the buildings lean gently, as if bowing in slow motion. Everything here is impossible, and somehow that makes it all the more real. You wake to the sound of water slapping gently against stone, like the city is stretching its arms after a long damp nap. There's a hush to Venice that's hard to explain. No engines revving, no screech of tyres, just footsteps, voices carried across courtyards, and the low murmur of boats brushing along the canals. And that's when it really hits you. This place has no streets, not in the way you're used to. No boulevards, no roundabouts, no grid system. Just a warped, watery labyrinth that wraps around itself like a half-forgotten dream. You step outside and immediately have to flatten yourself against the nearest wall to avoid colliding with a man pushing a handcart full of eggplants. There's no sidewalk, just narrow alleys called calli, some barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without holding their breath. You shuffle through one of them, twisting and turning, past plaster walls in shades of ochre, salmon and faded lavender, chipped just enough to look cinematic but not enough to be concerning. Then the alley spills open, and suddenly you're standing at the edge of a canal. No warning, no curb, one more step and you'd be swimming. A gondola glides by like it owns the place, which honestly, it kind of does. The gondolier doesn't break his rhythm. He stands, oar in hand, steering with lazy confidence. You can't even be mad. He's part of the architecture here. The Grand Canal snakes through the centre of Venice like a reversed question mark. 3 kilometres of main artery where boats, not cars, rule the day. Everything moves by water, people, produce, mail. Even garbage collection happens on boats. You spot a barge loaded with cardboard boxes labelled in 5 languages, and a guy casually smoking while tossing them onto a dock. Efficiency, Venetian style. This is a city that evolved in complete defiance of how cities should work. Elsewhere, infrastructure was designed around the wheel. In Venice, it's the hull. Instead of intersections, you get watery crossroads where gondolas, motorboats and delivery barges have to do this elegant, slow-motion ballet to avoid crashing. And yes, there are traffic jams, just wetter. Bridges become your lifeline. You start to appreciate them the way other people appreciate reliable Wi-Fi. There are more than 400 bridges scattered across the city, most arched just high enough to let small boats pass beneath. Many are stone, some are wood, and a few feel like they might collapse if you looked at them the wrong way, but they rarely do. The majority were built to accommodate foot traffic only, which means every step you take here was carved out for walking, not driving. And that's a whole thing unto itself. You feel it in your legs within hours. Venice demands walking, upstairs, over bridges, through alleys that twist like a knot in a sailor's rope. You don't just navigate Venice, you negotiate it. Every shortcut becomes a gamble. That narrow alley might lead to a charming square, or it might dead end at a mossy wall and a locked service door. There's no logic to the layout, no grid to help you orient. Locals don't use addresses, they use landmarks. Turn left after the bakery with the blue awning, then cross the bridge with the rusted lantern. And this delightful chaos was no accident. It was defensive. The original Venetians intentionally designed the city to be confusing, to thwart invaders and keep strangers guessing. Even if an enemy managed to land on one of the islands, they'd get lost in the maze long before reaching anything important. That chaos, that centuries of paranoia fossilized into urban planning. Tonight's fringe fact is a fun one. There are wheeled vehicles in Venice, but you almost never see them. A few handcarts for deliveries, maybe the occasional suitcase with rolling wheels. But once, centuries ago, someone tried to introduce horse-drawn carts to one of the larger islands, just to see if it would help. It didn't. Horses freaked out on the slippery stones, fell into canals and caused chaos in the already narrow passageways. That experiment ended fast. Horses and wheels simply don't belong here. Water won that argument. You duck under a low arch, step across a small bridge, and find yourself in one of the city's countless campi, little squares tucked away like secrets. Each one has a name, a church, maybe a cafe with 3 tables and a barista who doesn't smile unless you're bleeding. You sit at one of those tables now, sipping espresso, watching pigeons squabble like tiny mafia bosses. There's a rhythm here, a slowness that doesn't feel lazy. It feels earned. Like the city is asking you to look instead of rush. But even the calm has tension beneath it. Venice may not have cars, but it has currents. You notice it when a vaporetto, a public transport boat, passes by, and the canal rocks gently, sending small waves toward the stone foundations. Each slap of water against brick is a reminder. This is borrowed time. One flood, one storm surge, one unexpected high tide, and everything could go sideways. It always could. That tension is part of Venice's identity. It's not just a city, it's a balance. Between land and water, stability and surrender, the buildings rise out of the lagoon like they're in denial about the whole concept of physics, and yet they've been standing for centuries. Some of them have survived empires, plagues, invasions. They're not ruins, they're still homes, shops, schools, living things. There's scholarly debate about how intentional this all was. Some historians argue that Venice's boat-centric layout evolved naturally, out of necessity. Others think it was deliberate, an act of control and power. By eliminating wheeled transport, the Venetian elite made themselves indispensable as middlemen of the maritime world. No land route meant no direct invasion, no cavalry charge. It was brilliant. Or it was just dumb luck that worked out. Honestly, it might be both. You finish your coffee and walk to the edge of the square where another canal waits. A narrow one with walls so tight that if you reached out you could touch both sides. A small boat putters through, carrying what looks like a load of chairs. You don't even ask why. In Venice, chairs need their own water taxi. That's just how it is. You turn a corner and find yourself back where you started. Almost. But now it's different. You're starting to see the pattern in the chaos. The curves of the alleys, the rhythm of the bridges, the way the canals pull everything along like a gentle current beneath a floating dream. Venice isn't just a city with no streets, it's a city where the streets are alive, always moving, always whispering, and somehow, always holding together. You're standing at the edge of a narrow canal, watching a gondola drift toward you with the slow, deliberate elegance of a ballet dancer who knows exactly how good they look. The gondolier, dressed in the classic striped shirt and dark pants, stands with one foot slightly ahead of the other, or tucked under his arm like an extension of his body. You've seen boats before, canoes, kayaks, motorboats, but nothing like this. Gondolas aren't just boats, they're symbols, floating relics, and, as you're about to discover, engineering masterpieces disguised as romantic clichés. You hop aboard, wobbling just enough to remind everyone you're not from around here. The gondolier doesn't even flinch. With a smooth push, the gondola pulls away from the dock and slides into the canal centre. The water glitters beneath you, a blend of sunlight and murky green. And as you settle onto the plush seat, something starts to bug you. The gondola feels off-centre. It leans to one side, not in a sinking way, but in a weird, slightly crooked way, like the boat's been permanently stuck in a shrug. That's when the gondolier laughs and tells you the truth. The gondola is asymmetrical, built that way on purpose. One side is longer than the other, just slightly. It's a design quirk that counterbalances the gondolier's weight and rowing technique. Since they row from one side only, the hull needs that subtle curve to move straight instead of spinning in circles. It's like designing a shoe with a built-in limp, except it glides. Venetian boatmakers have been perfecting this wonky beauty for centuries. Each gondola is handcrafted, made of 8 different types of wood, and assembled using methods that border on wizardry. The boat's flat bottom makes it perfect for shallow canals, while the curve allows it to turn on a dime. Even the oar has its own sculpted groove, called a focola, designed to catch water at just the right angle for precise manoeuvres. The whole thing is absurdly over-engineered for what's essentially a fancy rowboat, but that's the Venetian way. Take something simple and make it operatic. Now for tonight's fringe fact, gondolas used to be wild, like full-on Mardi Gras party barges. Back in the day, wealthy Venetians would pimp out their gondolas with gilded carvings, vibrant paint jobs, velvet seats, and even musicians on board. It got so out of hand that in 1562 the city passed a law mandating that all gondolas had to be painted black. That's why they still are. Not for elegance, not for mystery, but because the Venetians got tired of each other showing off like medieval influences. You pass under a bridge now, and the gondola dips slightly with the movement of the water. You glance at the ferro, that weird S-shaped piece of metal on the bow. It's not just decorative, it's a symbol and a stabiliser. The 6 forward-facing prongs represent the 6 districts of Venice. The curve echoes the bend of the Grand Canal, and the small, backward-facing notch at the top, that's supposed to be the island of Giudecca. It's less a boat accessory and more a floating family crest. But gondolas aren't the only boats on the water, not even close. Venice has a whole taxonomy of boats. The traghetto, basically a gondola used to ferry people across canals without bridges. The sandolo, a lighter cousin of the gondola. Workboats, trash barges, police boats, ambulances, taxis, all specially shaped to handle Venice's tight spaces and shallow depths. It's like an aquatic version of a model train set, only scaled up and way more expensive. And steering a gondola? Not easy. You try it, briefly, in a quiet canal with no one watching. The gondolier hands you the oar, chuckling in advance. You plant your feet, grab the remo and push off. Immediately, the boat veers sharply to the left, then wobbles, then drifts sideways into a wall. You nearly topple a potted plant off someone's windowsill. The gondolier gently reclaims the oar like you're a toddler who just knocked over a tower of blocks and says, "It takes 10 years." 10 years. That's how long it takes to become a master gondolier. It's not just about muscle, it's memory, reflexes, an instinctive sense of timing. You have to memorize every corner, every current, every bridge height. You have to know how tides affect the turn of a canal. You have to dodge clueless tourists with cameras and selfie sticks, all while delivering smooth, graceful rides like it's no big deal. There's a whole guild of gondoliers, steeped in tradition and attitude. It used to be a family-only profession, passed from father to son, but now there are schools, licenses, and even exams. And in a big moment for the city, the first female gondolier in modern history was licensed in 2010. Her name, Georgia Boscolo. Some called it Progress, others called it Scandal, but she steers her gondola with the same precision as anyone else, cutting through centuries of tradition one oarstroke at a time. There's still debate, though, about where the gondola even came from. Some scholars argue it evolved from flat-bottomed fishing boats in the Adriatic. Others think it has Byzantine roots, or that it was inspired by Egyptian river crafts. What's certain is that the gondola we know today, long, sleek and black, didn't really show up until the 17th century. Before that, they looked, well, chunkier, less graceful, more like floating bathtubs with ambitions. As your ride winds through the quieter canals, you start to hear things you didn't notice before. A woman humming in an upper window, water sloshing gently against the buildings, a dog barking 2 blocks away, the sound bouncing through the maze of alleys and canals like it's playing Marco Polo. It's peaceful, haunting. And then, as you float past a crumbling palazzo, you see a doorway that opens directly onto the water. No steps, no platform. Just a wooden door and the canal lapping at the threshold. That was the original front door. For centuries, people stepped out of their homes straight into boats. No sidewalks, no stoops, just water and whatever floated by. It's an odd kind of intimacy. Like the canal itself was part of the household. A neighbour who delivered you to dinner and picked you up after parties. The gondolier pulls into a small dock, rope in hand, and ties the boat off with a knot so fast you barely catch it. You step out onto stone, legs a little wobbly, heart oddly full. You didn't just ride a boat, you time-travelled. You experience Venice on its own terms, slow, deliberate, off-kilter, and perfect in its defiance of logic. You look back at the gondola, its curved hull reflecting the last bits of afternoon light. It doesn't just carry people, it carries stories. And you realise that Venice, for all its fragility, floats on these stories. Anchored in mud, yes, but lifted by centuries of stubborn, brilliant design. You're ankle deep in water and trying to pretend like that's normal. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's not rushing in or trying to drag you under. It's more like the sea has just shown up, uninvited but smug. The stones beneath your feet are slick. The cold is creeping up your legs, and as you slosh through what used to be a perfectly respectable plaza, someone yells, "Acqua alta!" from a balcony like it's just another Tuesday. Because here in Venice it kind of is. High water. That's what acqua alta means. A pretty name for what is, functionally, a seasonal wet slap across the face of the city. It happens mostly in autumn and winter, when tides, rain, and atmospheric pressure team up to make life in Venice feel like you're living inside a slowly sinking bathtub. Tourists panic. Locals just roll up their pants and keep walking, as if knee-deep flooding is no more disruptive than spilled coffee. But rewind a few centuries, and acqua alta wasn't just a quirky inconvenience, it was a full-blown engineering nightmare. See, when the early Venetians started building on their marshy islands, they were already in a tense relationship with the sea. Too little water, and the canals dried out and stank. Too much, and your living room turned into a fish tank. So, for hundreds of years, they played a dangerous balancing game with the tides. You stand now on a bridge in Cannaregio, watching the canal below surge with the slow rhythm of the lagoon. This isn't just ocean water, it's a blend. Part salt, part fresh, part mystery. And it enters the city through 3 narrow inlets at the barrier islands. Every 6 hours the tide rushes in, then ebbs out like a giant exhale. If you're a 13th century engineer, this is both beautiful and horrifying. So what do? You start designing water flow like it's a military campaign. Early Venetian hydrologists, who weren't called that because the term didn't exist yet, but you get the idea, began rerouting rivers. The Brenta, the Piave, the Sile. These were major waterways that dumped fresh water and sediment into the lagoon. And sediment? Not great when you're trying to keep water deep and navigable. So the Venetians did something audacious. They moved the rivers. Entire courses of rivers were redirected to flow around the lagoon instead of into it. Giant stone embankments were built, channels dredged, swamps dried. And it worked. Kind of. For a while. But the sea was never going to sit back and politely follow orders. Here's your quirky fact of the night. At one point, Venice almost tried to stop the tide altogether. A 16th century proposal suggested building massive gates across the lagoon's inlets to control the sea's flow entirely. It was rejected for being too expensive, too risky, and, This is the kicker, too arrogant. Imagine that. A city built on a swamp, already suspended on wooden stilts, saying, that's a little too much engineering. Irony would later return wearing a $7 billion price tag, but we'll get to that. Anyway, the real genius was in the canals themselves. They weren't random. They were designed, or at least tuned, to help move water. Like arteries, they pump and flush the lagoon, using the tides to keep things flowing and somewhat clean. Some even have special S-curves to control current speed and prevent erosion. Others were straight up expanded or deepened over time to serve specific trade routes. Venice is a hydraulic machine disguised as a city. There's still debate about just how much of this was intentional versus emergent. Did the Venetians design this system from the start, or did they just keep reacting to disasters until the city took on this shape? Some historians argue it was more instinctive than planned, a series of brilliant patches rather than a grand vision. Others say there was a vision driven by a powerful governing body called the Magistrato alle Acque, a sort of early water management council with alarming amounts of power and responsibility. The truth is likely somewhere in between, planned chaos. You walk now along the edge of the Grand Canal, the water lapping higher than usual. Wooden platforms, temporary walkways called passerelle, are being laid out like cautious bridges above the puddles. You hop onto one, balancing as it rocks slightly beneath your weight, and make your way toward Piazza San Marco. Bad idea. The piazza is Venice's lowest point, and during acqua alta, it becomes the city's unofficial swimming pool. You reach it just in time to see water bubbling up through the drains like champagne. Locals know better than to walk across it right now, but tourists, of course, can't resist. You spot one group barefoot, shoes in hand, trying to wade through while pretending it's charming. It is, until you remember that Venetian canal water is not exactly pristine. The thing is, Venice isn't being flooded from above. The water doesn't fall, it rises, it seeps up through the stones, through the ancient foundations, through the pores of the city itself. It's not aggressive, it's patient. It doesn't crash in like a tsunami, it sneaks up like a clever joke, a very damp, very expensive joke. And yet, for centuries, the Venetians adapted. They built taller thresholds, raised floors, designed furniture with short legs so it could be moved quickly in a flood. Palazzos were constructed with a piano nobile, a noble floor raised above street level to stay dry. And even as the city weathered storms, invasions, and plagues, the sea remained the oldest, most persistent threat. You take refuge beneath a stone arcade, listening to water echo in the colonnades. The air smells of seaweed and stone, of salt and decay. Venice has always smelled like this. It's part of the charm, half perfume, half warning. It's getting darker now and the water has reached the steps of the basilica. You watch as a group of workers set up a small pump near the entrance, hoses snaking away into the night. One of them catches your eye and shrugs as if to say, "Another day, another flood." And still, the city endures. Venice doesn't fight the water anymore. It never really did. It learned to live with it, to make space for it. That's the secret. What separates this city from others. Most cities see water as an enemy to be held back, buried, banished underground in pipes and storm drains. Venice welcomes it to the table, gives it a seat, and just prays it doesn't overstay its welcome. So you walk, again, through ankle-deep water. Not because you want to, but because that's what you do here. You adapt, you float, in your own way. Because Venice doesn't exist in spite of the water, it exists because of it. The sun creeps back over the lagoon with that pale, watery glow unique to Venice, like daylight's been diluted in brine. Today, you're headed for something solid, or at least something that's trying to look solid. You're standing on the edge of the Grand Canal, gazing at one of the city's most iconic landmarks, the Rialto Bridge. It's massive, elegant, old, and just a little bit smug about its own survival. And if you're sensing a theme here, yes, this is another feat of engineering genius that absolutely should not have worked. But it did, because Venice is stubborn like that. The Rialto wasn't the first bridge over the Grand Canal, but it's the one everyone remembers. Before this elegant arch existed, there were boats, then a rickety wooden bridge, then another one, and then, predictably, fire, collapse, rebuild, collapse again. Venice had serious bridge commitment issues for a while. That is, until the late 1500s, when the city decided it was time to go big or go home. You're now in the year 1588. surrounded by master builders, city officials, and a whole lot of skeptics. The plan on the table is to build a stone bridge, one single arch of solid Istrian limestone spanning the widest point of the Grand Canal without supports in the water. People are losing their minds. A single arch stone bridge of that size, unprecedented, unstable, likely to snap in half and dump a few hundred pedestrians into the canal on opening day. Architects from all over submit proposals, including Michelangelo himself, but in the end, Venice chooses Antonio da Ponte, whose name literally means Tony of the Bridge, so maybe destiny played a hand here. Construction begins and everyone holds their breath. The design is bold, a stone arch rising nearly 24 feet above the canal, supported at either end by thousands of wooden piles driven deep into the mud. On top, a wide walkway lined with shops, because Venice never passes up a chance to mix commerce with architecture. Every stone is carved by hand, every support beam placed with mathematical precision. It's a tense couple of years. Now here's your quirky fact. While it was under construction, Venetian gossip columns, yes, they had those, openly mocked the bridge as Da Ponte's folly. People bet on how long it would stand before collapsing. Engineers from Florence and Milan came to shake their heads disapprovingly. And yet, in 1591, when the bridge finally opens, nothing collapses. The stone holds, the arch stands, the shops open, the city celebrates. And those critics, silenced. Possibly by the sheer weight of their own embarrassment. You step onto the bridge now, following the same route countless feet have taken over 4 centuries. The stones are smooth, worn to a gentle shine by the souls of merchants, tourists, beggars, nobles and pickpockets. You pass under the central arch, flanked by tiny stores selling overpriced glass and vaguely nautical t-shirts. There's an energy here, a buzz that never really fades, no matter the season. And then you pause at the top and turn around. The view is ridiculous. The Grand Canal curves off in both directions, flanked by buildings that look like they've been painted onto the air itself. Water taxis hum below. Gondolas drift with practiced grace. Laundry flutters from windows like medieval flags. It's all so delicate, so improbable, and beneath your feet, one stone arch, defying physics and expectation since the Renaissance. But not everyone agrees on why it's lasted this long. Some argue it's the wood, again, with thousands of piles creating an underground forest that's never shifted. Others say it's the careful shape of the arch, which distributes weight perfectly. Still others think it's the secret mortar recipe used by Da Ponte's crew, some combination of lime, volcanic ash, and powdered ambition. No one's cracked the formula exactly. The city guards its secrets. You descend the far side of the bridge, landing in the old Rialto market district. This was once the heart of Venetian trade. Spices, silks, silver, and occasionally shady deals behind shuttered doors. The bridge connected the commercial core of Venice with the rest of the city. It wasn't just a crossing, it was a statement. We're not going anywhere, it seemed to say. We'll build on mud, we'll span the sea, and we'll do it with style. Of course, there were plans for other bridges across the Grand Canal, but none came until centuries later. The Accademia Bridge wouldn't show up until the 19th century, and it was originally made of wood. The Scalzi Bridge arrived in the 1930s, and the infamous Calatrava Bridge. That one came in the 2000s, cost too much, looks like an airport installation, and made everyone mad. Venetians don't like new things, they like right things, and the Rialto is the right kind of old. Another fun fact. For centuries, the Rialto was one of the only reliable ways to cross the Grand Canal without a boat. That meant everyone used it. Nobles, labourers, fishmongers, thieves. It was the city's ultimate melting pot. Weddings crossed here, funerals passed beneath it, deals were struck, secrets traded, and sometimes people just stood at the top to watch the world float by, much like you're doing now. You sit down at the edge, your feet dangling just above the water. A gondola slips past, the gondolier humming something ancient and tuneless. You can hear voices, Italian, English, French, all blending into the salty air. The city is alive, layered with noise and memory. There's a scholarly debate you overhear at the cafe behind you. 2 students arguing whether the bridge was meant to be temporary. Some say Da Ponte's design was only supposed to last a few decades, a stopgap until something better came along. Others argue it was always meant to be permanent, a bold gesture from a city that was constantly at war with gravity and tide. There's no final answer. The bridge refuses to clarify, and maybe that's the charm. The Rialto is like Venice itself, both temporary and eternal, bold and delicate, loud and quiet at the same time. It was mocked, doubted and nearly rejected, and yet, here it is, stronger than the laughter, older than most of the countries that scoffed at it. You stand and start walking again, crossing back over towards San Polo. The sun is higher now, catching the tips of the rooftops in pale gold. You glance back one last time. The bridge looks solid, still standing, still smug. And honestly, it's earned it. You're sipping a lukewarm espresso in the shadow of a bell tower, staring up at something that looks too tall and too calm for its own good. It's the Campanile di San Marco, the giant brick toothpick that juts up from the piazza like it's trying to tickle the clouds. It's neat, elegant, a little plain by Venetian standards, and it absolutely shouldn't make you nervous. And yet, you can't quite shake the feeling that this thing might just fall over again. Because it has. It literally collapsed once, without warning, without apology, and with all the drama of a diva who decided the stage wasn't big enough. But back up a few centuries first. The original Campanile, bell tower in Italian, goes back to the 9th century, a time when Venice was still figuring out whether it was a marsh town, a trading hub, or a real city. They started modest, probably just a wooden tower or something basic to call people to prayer. But then came upgrades, bricklayers, arches, decorative flourishes. By the early 1500s, the tower reached its most iconic form, a 99-metre marvel of red brick topped with a golden weather vane in the shape of the Archangel Gabriel. It was tall, impressive, functional, and beloved. Fast forward to the morning of July 14th, 1902. The tower's been standing tall for over 400 years. Venice is waking up slowly, the pigeons are already plotting world domination, and the Campanile starts creaking. Not dramatically, just a whisper, a suggestion. Over the next few hours the creaks become cracks, and then, without any real ceremony, the entire tower collapses in on itself like a folding chair that just gave up. It didn't topple sideways, it crumbled straight down, pancaking into a neat pile of rubble, like it knew how to fall politely. Miraculously, no one dies. Not even the cat who lived in the tower, a little guy named Melampage. Yes, really. There was a tower cat, and yes, it walked away unbothered like it knew this would happen. The square is stunned. Venetians gather in shock, mourning a symbol that had loomed over them for generations, and immediately they decide to rebuild. Dov'era com'era, they say, where it was and how it was. None of that modern nonsense, no redesigns, just the exact same tower, put right back where it belonged, like the collapse was just a glitch in the Matrix. And that's your quirky fact. The 1902 collapse of the Campanile is one of the few architectural disasters in history that led to an almost pixel-perfect remake. They didn't try to innovate. They tried to restore time itself. Construction took about 10 years. The new tower, opened in 1912, used better internal reinforcement, hidden steel elements and careful brickwork to ensure no surprise collapses next time. From the outside, identical. Even the Golden Angel was restored and polished to the same eerie shine. The city had pressed undo on reality, and somehow gotten away with it. Today you stand at the base, neck craned, eyeing the summit. The tower leans ever so slightly, just a whisper of tilt. But that's Venice for you. Everything leans. You walk slowly across the piazza, imagining what it must have felt like that morning, watching something so permanent simply vanish. There are photos, of course, grainy black and whites that show the rubble, the stunned crowds, the dust. But even those feel surreal. Venice isn't supposed to collapse. It's supposed to wobble in an elegant way, like a tightrope walker who's just daring gravity to try something. You step into the base of the rebuilt Campanile and take the elevator. Yes, there's an elevator now, all the way to the top. It's quiet inside, echoing with centuries of breath and bells. When you reach the summit, the city unfolds beneath you in impossible angles. Rooftops stack like playing cards. Canals shimmer like silver veins. The lagoon stretches out toward the sea, blurring into the horizon. The bells hang above you, massive and old. They don't ring every hour anymore, just for special occasions. But when they do ring, the sound rolls across the city like a ripple in the air. You can feel it in your chest before you hear it in your ears. That was the Campanile's original purpose, to speak to the whole city at once. Fire warning, bell, War approaching, bell. Plague incoming, bell, bell, bell. It wasn't just a tower, it was the city's megaphone. There's scholarly debate about what caused the original collapse. Some say lightning strikes over the centuries weakened the brickwork. Others point to small structural repairs made in the 1800s that may have compromised the stability. A few even blame vibrations from the bells themselves. One particularly poetic theory suggests the tower simply gave up after outliving its original purpose, tired of standing watch over a city that had changed too much. You're not sure. Standing up here now, the tower feels patient, almost bored, like it knows how dramatic its own story is but refuses to brag. You lean against the railing and breathe in the city's strange, salty air. The wind up here tastes cleaner than down in the alleys. You can smell the sea more than the stone. Below, tourists scatter like ants across the piazza, chasing pigeons or ice cream or some angle for a photo they've already taken. And yet, none of them seem to notice that they're walking through a ghost, through a space that once held rubble and disbelief and was then simply reborn. You take the elevator back down and step into the square again. The tower looms behind you now, silent but unmissable. It's part of the background, part of the skyline, a landmark that died and came back without changing a single thing. And that maybe is the real miracle of Venice. Not just surviving against the sea or the tide or time, but surviving its own undoing, falling flat on its face and then standing back up, dusting itself off, and carrying on like nothing happened. The Campanile doesn't need to impress you. It already has. It fell, it got back up, and now it watches the city again, day after day, quietly daring the sky to try something. You're standing next to a canal that smells like yesterday's seafood, watching as a slow ripple of water washes over the cobblestones and disappears into a storm drain that you really hope works. But the truth is, it probably doesn't. Not the way you're thinking. Because here's something Venice doesn't advertise. This city, this glowing, glittering, romantic maze of marble and myth, is, and always has been, absolutely filthy. But wait, before you flinch and cancel your trip, remember that filth and survival go hand in hand here. Venice was built in mud. It was born in swamp water and seaweed. It grew out of fishnets and grit, and keeping it livable? That took some of the strangest and most underappreciated engineering solutions in history. You're not just walking through a floating city, you're walking through a centuries-old plumbing experiment that somehow kept plague at bay longer than it had any right to. Let's start with a simple question. Where does the sewage go? The answer is nowhere. Or rather, everywhere. You see, Venice doesn't have a modern sewer system. It never really did. Most buildings, especially the older ones, were connected to what are politely called pozzi neri, or black wells. Picture this, a large stone cistern beneath your house, designed to hold, everything you flushed or washed or dumped. When it got full, someone came and scooped it out. By hand. That's right. There were actual human beings whose job it was to row around in boats, dig out buckets of sludge from beneath your floors, and cart it away. Dignity optional. These brave souls were called nightmen, and they usually did their work in the dark for obvious reasons. They were paid little, respected less, and probably smelled like boiled nightmares. But they were vital. Without them, Venice would have drowned in its own waste before it ever worried about the sea. Quirky fact alert. Some of these waste collectors worked in near silence. It was part of the job description. They weren't just night workers, they were stealth night workers. The idea was to avoid reminding the aristocracy that their luxurious canal-side palazzos were essentially built on personal septic tanks. Out of sight, out of smell, unless the tide was particularly rude that week. And if you're wondering how any of this kept disease away, well, it didn't. At least not always. You walk now through the sestiere of Santa Croce, passing ancient facades streaked with centuries of damp. This area was once home to Venice's main slaughterhouses and tanneries, places that, how do we put this gently, redefine the concept of runoff. Animal guts, blood, chemical residue. It all flowed eventually into the canals. There was no filtration. The tide was the filtration. The very heartbeat of Venice flushed the system twice a day, out with the old, in with the slightly less awful. But even with all that, Venice managed to avoid the worst of the medieval plagues for longer than most major cities. Not forever, don't get cocky, but long enough to make people wonder, how? Here's where the scholars argue. Some believe it was the constant tidal motion that kept stagnant pools from forming. Others point to the isolation, each house its own little island, making large-scale contagion harder to spread at first. Then there's the theory that Venice, with its paranoia and trade wealth, simply reacted faster. Ships entering the lagoon were forced to quarantine, literally. The term comes from 40 giorni, or 40 days. That's how long sailors had to wait at the Lazaretto Islands before setting foot on shore. No exceptions, no bribes. Venice didn't mess around. And that brings us to the Lazarettos, the original quarantine stations. You're now standing on the edge of a water taxi dock staring out toward one of them, Lazaretto Vecchio. Doesn't look like much from here, just a lump of stone and grass. But this was ground zero for Venice's plague control. If a ship showed signs of disease, coughing, fever, rats playing poker below deck, it was diverted here. The sick were separated from the healthy, sometimes treated, sometimes just left. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In fact, it was revolutionary. Here's the weird twist. Venice's commitment to quarantine was both scientific and theatrical. Officials dressed in the now infamous plague doctor outfits, long-beaked masks, flowing robes, wide-brimmed hats, not because it helped, but because it looked like they were in control. The beak was stuffed with herbs, the hat was a symbol of authority, and the whole get-up was designed to scream, "Don't question me, I'm basically a science wizard." But Venice didn't rely on theatrics alone. The city also developed one of the earliest versions of contact tracing. If a person died of plague, their home was marked, their belongings burned, and everyone they'd interacted with was watched or locked in. Whole families quarantined in their homes, meals delivered by boat, conversations shouted through windows. Still, even with all this effort, the plague hit hard. The worst waves came in 1575 and 1630, killing tens of thousands. That's a third of the population, gone in months. You walk now through narrow alleys that echo with footsteps, and it's hard not to imagine how silent they must have been during those times. Whole neighbourhoods empty, gondolas used as hearses, bells tolling constantly. It wasn't romantic, it was survival in slow motion. And yet, after each wave, the city came back. Not just physically, but socially. Venice built plague churches. Yes, literal cathedrals of survival. One of them, the Church of the Redentor, was constructed as an offering to God after the 1575 outbreak. Designed by Palladio, it sits serenely across the water on the island of Giudecca, its steps wide enough for pilgrims to climb barefoot in prayer. To this day, Venetians still celebrate its founding every July with a floating bridge and candlelit procession, like they're personally thanking the city for not dying. So here you are, walking through a city built on mud, defended by isolation, cleansed by tides, and scrubbed by men who carried buckets of human waste in silence. And somehow, it all worked. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to keep the city alive when logic said it should have drowned in its own filth 1,000 years ago. You pass a drain now, tucked into the base of a centuries-old building. It's old, cracked, but still there. Still doing its quiet, dirty job. The canal beside it gurgles as the tide starts to pull out again. The water shifts, swirling through layers of silt, carrying away everything the city doesn't want to remember. You're squinting into the morning haze as a boat cuts across the water, its hull bouncing with enough enthusiasm to suggest it's not just any boat, it's headed somewhere special. You're on your way to Murano, Venice's infamous glass island, where the furnaces never sleep and the air smells faintly of ash, ambition, and melted genius. From the moment the boat docks, you can feel the heat. Even on a cool day, there's this strange lingering warmth, like the ground remembers centuries of fire. Because this little island, it didn't just make glass, it made empires. Venice and glass go together like gondolas and overpricing. But here's the kicker. The most delicate art in the city, the shimmering chandeliers, the paper-thin goblets, the mirror-still panels that once decorated royal palaces, was born not out of creativity but paranoia. The year is 1291, and the Venetian government, in a move that's either incredibly cautious or low-key sinister, orders all glassmakers to move their furnaces off the main islands. Official reason? Fire risk? Real reason? Trade secrets. See, by this point, Venetian glass was already world famous. Crowned heads of Europe wanted it. Ottoman sultans paid big for it. and Venice was determined to keep its recipes and its artisans on a tight leash. So they moved the whole operation to Murano, this quiet island just north of the main city, and turned it into a combination fortress, workshop, and very pretty prison. You wander now into one of the old workshops, where a master glassblower stands in front of a roaring furnace, casually rolling molten glass onto the end of a pipe like it's no big deal. The temperature here, a cool 1,500 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than lava. You stand a little farther back. The process is hypnotic. The glass starts as a glowing blob, the colour of lava and honey mixed together. The artisan blows gently into the pipe, and the blob inflates like a balloon. Then, with a few elegant turns and some sculpting tools that look like they belong in a dental nightmare, he shapes it, stretching, twisting, adding colour, coaxing form out of heat and chaos. Within minutes, it becomes a fish, or a horse, or a ridiculously fragile vase that you would absolutely break within 24 hours. And here's your quirky fact of the night. Glassblowers on Murano were once forbidden from leaving. Not just discouraged, forbidden. The Venetian Republic passed laws declaring that any glassmaker who tried to take their skills to another country would be considered a traitor. Some were hunted down, others were bribed to stay. A few, according to legend, were disappeared into the lagoon, never to be seen again. So yes, Venetian glass was literally protected by a kind of artisanal mafia. Why all the drama? Because this wasn't just about pretty things, it was about economics. Venice dominated the luxury goods market for centuries, and glass was one of its crown jewels. Murano developed secret techniques: crystal clear glass, coloured glass, filigree, enamel painting, aventurine, glass flecked with shimmering copper, and mirrors so smooth they were basically magical. At one point, Venetian mirrors were more valuable than gold. Royals across Europe begged for them. And Venice? Venice sold just enough to stay rich, and kept the real secrets locked in a furnace behind closed doors. You step into a small museum now, tucked away behind a glass factory. It's quiet inside, all smooth tile floors and soft lighting. The displays shimmer with artifacts, 15th century goblets, twisted like sugar. A chandelier so fragile you wince just looking at it. Delicate perfume bottles with necks thinner than a strand of hair. These aren't just trinkets, they're power in solid form, objects that carried the mystique of a republic built on trade, flair and ruthless control. But of course, not everything went according to plan. There's an open debate among historians about just how well Venice protected its glass monopoly. Some say the tight security worked for centuries, keeping Murano's secrets safe and profitable. Others argue that rival nations, France especially, eventually lured artisans away with promises of money and freedom. By the 17th century, France had its own mirror industry, and Venice's edge started to dull. The Industrial Revolution didn't help either. Handmade glass struggled against mass production. What had once been exclusive became, over time, collectible, then decorative, then novelty. But Murano survived. It adapted. Sort of. You walk now through the heart of the island, where old factories lean against each other like retired gladiators. Some are still active, with glowing furnaces and clanging metal, and the low rumble of glass being reborn. Others have gone quiet, converted into galleries, shops, or eerily quiet ruins. The island has the strange feeling of a place that once ruled the world, and now just hosts the tourists who buy the keychains. That said, the talent's still here. You stop to watch a young glassblower in a back alley workshop, clearly someone trying to revive the old magic. He's making millefiori beads, tiny flowers frozen in glass, sliced like candy and polished until they gleam. It's absurdly delicate work, and he does it with the casual confidence of someone who's done it 1,000 times. You ask him how long it takes to learn. He shrugs and says, 10 years to be decent, a lifetime to be good. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Venice is like that, a city that demands time, patience and fire, and nowhere shows that better than Murano. Back on the boat, you watch the island recede into the haze. The lagoon stretches out, deceptively calm, as if nothing dangerous ever happened here. But you know better. Murano wasn't just an artisan colony. It was a pressure cooker full of fire, politics, secrets and explosions. Oh right, forgot to mention that. Glass making, occasionally explosive. Mix the wrong chemicals, overheat the wrong mix, and boom. There are stories, half true, half legend, of furnaces erupting like miniature volcanoes, sending shards into the rafters and scaring the fancy out of visiting nobles. You lean back now, eyes half closed, the wind salty on your skin. You've walked through a place where people quite literally breathed art into molten sand, where empire was forged in fire, and where the shimmer of a single glass bead might have once decided a royal marriage. And somewhere behind the haze the furnaces still burn. You wake to the rhythmic thud of hammers, the sharp clink of metal on metal echoing across the water like a blacksmith's heartbeat. But this isn't the sound of someone fixing a railing or patching up a palazzo. This is something bigger. You're heading toward one of the most overlooked wonders of Venice, the Arsenale. It's not a palace, not a church. There are no chandeliers here, no golden mosaics or romantic gondolas. Instead, there are walls, tall, bricked and fortress thick, rising out of the lagoon like a challenge. This was Venice's war machine, and if the main islands are its heart, the Arsenale was its fists. The word arsenal comes from Arabic, Dar al-Sinaa, the house of manufacture, and boy did Venice take that concept seriously. Starting in the 12th century, they began constructing a vast shipyard complex tucked into the eastern edge of the city, expanding it steadily until it became the largest industrial facility in Europe. At its peak, it covered over 45 hectares and employed something like 16,000 people. That's not a typo. 16,000. In a floating city made of stone and wood, Venice built a shipyard that could outproduce entire nations. You step through the imposing Porta Magna, the monumental gate flanked by stone lions and fluted columns, like a classical temple swallowed by an industrial revolution. Inside, it's not quiet. Even centuries later, the ghosts of forges and saws linger. You can almost hear it. The buzz of saw blades cutting planks, the roar of furnaces smelting nails and bolts, the groan of timber being shaped into hulls. This was Venice's other secret weapon. Its ability to build galleys not in months but in days. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The Arsenale was the world's first assembly line. Seriously. Long before Henry Ford rolled out Model Ts, Venice was rolling out warships using a pre-industrial conveyor belt of people and parts. A galley could be built from scratch, fully rigged and ready to sail, in less than 24 hours. That's not a legend. That's documented. And yes, it blows everyone's minds. How did they do it? Organisation, standardisation, and an army of specialists. One crew cut planks, another shaped the ribs, a third group forged nails. Every step in the process was managed, recorded, and optimised. Workers moved like clockwork. Each ship was built with identical parts, making repairs and replacements quick and predictable. The Arsenale was a machine, and the ships it produced weren't just vessels, they were tools of control. You walk past one of the long rope-making halls, where they once twisted hemp into anchor cables the thickness of your leg. The space is absurdly long, like it was built to stretch time as well as rope. The original building still stands, its wood beams darkened by smoke and age. You reach out and run your fingers along the walls, wondering how many generations of hands did the same, hauling lines that would eventually drag anchors or hoist sails over enemy fleets. Quirky fact of the day: the Arsenale wasn't just about ships. They made everything here. Cannons, uniforms, oars, even the barrels of wine for sailors. There was a bakery that produced enough bread to feed an army. Blacksmiths, rope spinners, sailmakers, tailors. Imagine a floating IKEA crossed with a naval base and then drenched in salt water and sweat. That was the Arsenale. And you know what's even more bizarre? It was top secret. For most of its life, the entire complex was closed to outsiders. Travellers who asked too many questions were watched. Workers who talked too much didn't work for long. Venice knew it had something powerful, and it protected it like a dragon guards gold. Even other Venetians didn't fully understand what went on behind those red walls. It was like an engine humming beneath the city, only noticed when the galleys came pouring out. But of course, nothing lasts forever. By the 18th century, the Arsenale started to slow down. Technology was changing. Wooden galleys gave way to larger, heavier ships of the line. Vessels the Arsenale wasn't really designed to produce. Steam came next, and with it, a whole new approach to shipbuilding. The Venetians, so often ahead, began to fall behind. The workforce shrank. The buildings aged. The roar of industry became a whisper. Historians still argue over how much the Arsenale contributed to Venice's rise. Some claim it was the single most important asset the Republic ever had, more vital than the Doge, the Senate, even the merchant fleet. Others argue that it was just one piece in a larger puzzle, a symbol of control rather than its source. Either way, you can't deny its impact. Venice ruled the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, and the Arsenale was the muscle behind the diplomacy. Today, parts of the Arsenale are open to the public, especially during the Biennale, when artists and architects invade the space and fill it with sculptures, light shows, and enormous projections that dance across the brick walls. You step into one such hall now, its high ceilings filled with silence and dust. It smells of wood, sea, and faint electricity. It feels haunted, but not by ghosts, by labour. The kind of work that shapes nations but leaves no statues behind. You imagine the docks, once full of half-built ships, the supervisors shouting orders, the workers barefoot, shirtless, sunburned and covered in splinters. The sound of 1,000 hammers striking at once, so rhythmic it almost felt musical. It was a city within the city, powered not by gears or engines but by people. A symphony of labour orchestrated by obsession. You step outside again, blinking in the sun. The red walls of the Arsenale stand firm, reflected in the canal like a memory trying to become real. There's no real plaque explaining what this place once meant. No giant tourist sign with flashing lights. Just history buried in brick, waiting for someone to walk by and notice. And now you have. You're not sure when the water started creeping in. It's not like a wave crashed over the side of a building, or a dramatic geyser erupted from the cobblestones. It's more subtle than that. One moment, the square was dry. The next, your shoes are doing an unwanted little splash dance, and your phone just buzzed with a friendly alert from the local government. Acqua alta expected. Please take appropriate precautions. Translation: good luck, and may your socks survive. Welcome to the tide is too damn high season. Venetians have been dealing with acqua alta for so long that they've made an art out of inconvenience. In some neighbourhoods, you can spot old women walking through shin-deep water, like it's Tuesday laundry day. Shopkeepers have developed a sixth sense for when to move the merchandise 2 shelves higher. Public officials roll out passerelle, those narrow metal platforms you wobbled across earlier, with a kind of efficiency that suggests this isn't their first rodeo. And tourists? Oh, they panic. You see one now, barefoot in designer sandals, holding up a dripping map like it's going to offer salvation. Classic. But what you're experiencing today isn't just the usual soggy feet. This is a real flood. Not the end of days kind, but the sort that slowly and stubbornly transforms Venice from a walking city to a floating obstacle course. This one came in fast, an overnight wind shift, a low-pressure system, a moon that looked the other way. You never know which combination of weather and whimsy will send the lagoon spilling over the edges. It's not chaos, it's just Venice. And if you think this is bad, imagine it before the alert systems, before satellite models, before waterproof boots. There were times, especially in the 20th century, when flooding would strike hard and suddenly catching even seasoned locals off guard. The worst of them all, that would be the flood of 1966, November 4th, a dark, stormy day in Italian history when Venice drowned. Not figuratively, but literally. The tide reached 194 centimetres above normal. That's over 6 feet. Entire ground floors disappeared. Electrical systems failed. Frescoes and artworks were damaged beyond repair. And for the first time, the rest of Italy, and the world, realised just how fragile this floating dream really was. The event kicked off decades of research, controversy, despair, and eventually a solution so expensive and complex it might as well have been engineered by a Bond villain. More on that in a moment. First, your quirky fact of the day. During an acqua alta, some churches keep paddleboards or inflatable rafts on hand to ferry sacred items out of danger. A priest in San Cassiano once loaded a statue of the Virgin Mary onto an air mattress and floated it down the nave like a slow-motion miracle. Faith and flexibility, all in one image. Anyway, you've now detoured into a narrow side street, half wading, half floating, past closed shop shutters, and dogs that clearly hate getting their paws wet. The water is rising, and you're starting to wonder, why does this keep happening? Is it just the tide, or is something bigger going on? The answer is both. Yes, acqua alta is a natural phenomenon linked to lunar cycles, weather and sea pressure. but it's also being turbocharged by climate change and human interference. The Mediterranean is rising. Venice is sinking at a rate of 1 to 2 millimeters a year, give or take, depending on who you ask. Add storm surges and increasingly erratic weather to that mix, and voila, a city with a flooding problem that's only getting worse. That brings us to MOSE. No, not the profit. This MOSE stands for Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, Venice's mega-engineered attempt to hold back the sea. Construction began in 2003, and after decades of delays, scandals, and a budget that ballooned past €7 billion, the system is finally functional. In theory, anyway. But that's the next chapter. For now, just know this. Venice is playing chess with the sea, and the tide isn't bluffing. Back in the present, you slosh into a campo now mostly underwater. A child in bright yellow boots is happily jumping in puddles, while her nonna yells at her in full-volume Venetian dialect. A man on a boat is delivering bottled water, because yes, despite being surrounded by it, Venice has to import drinking water from the mainland. That irony never gets old. You take a moment to stand on the doorstep of a closed cafe, watching the lagoon blur the lines between canal and sidewalk. The city isn't panicking, it's adjusting, like it always does. Furniture is stacked, sandbags are placed. Life continues, slower, wetter, but steady. This isn't a crisis, it's a rhythm, and Venice, for all its fragility, is built to sway with it. You pass by one of those ancient marble tide markers embedded in the wall, little stone rulers that track how high the water has climbed over the years. The most recent one has a black line halfway up your thigh. You stare at it for a second and realise that's not history, that's a warning. There's still debate among scientists and engineers about how long Venice can last. Some believe MOSE will buy time, maybe a century or two. Others see it as a band-aid on a sinking ship. A few more radical minds have suggested floating the entire city on a platform, or pumping water under the foundations to lift it like a hydraulic miracle. So far, none of those ideas have made it out of the fantasy stage. But then again, Venice itself was a fantasy once, a city in a swamp, a republic on stilts, an empire that ran on canals. Every generation has looked at it and thought, this won't last, and every generation has been wrong so far. You finally find higher ground, shoes squelching with every step. The water's receding now, pulled gently back into the lagoon as the tide changes. The air smells faintly of algae and stone and something metallic. You pause, looking out across the shimmering surface, and think about all the people who've stood in this same spot, watching the sea come and go. And maybe that's the strange magic of Venice. It doesn't resist the water, it makes room for it, it dances with it, it leaks, and it sinks, and it sways, and somehow that makes it stronger than any place you've ever known. The morning after a flood is oddly quiet, not peaceful, just exhausted. You're walking through streets that still shine with wetness, every stone glistening under a low grey sky. Shopkeepers are sweeping water out of their doorways, tourists are pretending nothing happened, and somewhere in the distance a street performer is already setting up with a violin and a plastic bucket for coins. And you're on your way to meet the monster. Not a literal monster, no tentacles or glowing eyes, but a mechanical beast hidden beneath the sea, one of the most expensive, controversial and wildly ambitious infrastructure projects in European history. Its name is MOSE, and if Venice has any hope of surviving the next 100 years, this is the thing that's supposed to make it happen. You catch a vaporetto, a public boat, and head toward the Lido, one of the long barrier islands that guard the Venetian lagoon. It's not all beach umbrellas and sunbathers out here. This is where MOSE lives, down below the surf, buried in the sand like a sleeping leviathan. MOSE is short for Modulo Sperimentale Elettromeccanico, which is just a fancy Italian way of saying, let's build a $7 billion underwater gate system and pray it works. The idea is simple enough in theory. When the sea threatens to rise too high, MOSE lifts up a series of giant metal gates, 78 in total, blocking the 3 inlets that connect the lagoon to the Adriatic Sea. In calm weather, the gates lie flat on the seabed, invisible. But when the cool goes out, they rise, pushed up by compressed air, forming a barrier that can hold back tides as high as 3 meters. You can't see the gates themselves, they're underwater, and security is tight. But the control centre nearby is straight out of a Bond movie. Clean lines, reinforced glass, glowing monitors, and engineers with expressions that say, "We've read every doomsday report and we're still here." You get a glimpse into the command room, where data streams in from sensors all over the lagoon. Tide gauges, wind forecasts, barometric pressure, all fed into an algorithm that decides when to lift the gates. And when they do rise, it's a show. On the right day, you can stand on the beach and watch the gates emerge from the sea like rust-coloured fins. They're massive, 20 to 30 metres long, 5 metres thick, and they move slowly, deliberately, with a quiet sense of purpose. It takes about 30 minutes to fully deploy them. Once in place, they block the incoming tide from entering the lagoon, effectively turning Venice into a temporary fortress. Quirky fact: during early tests, a few fish got trapped between the gates and became unintentional symbols of the project's growing pains. One poor eel made the local paper. For a few weeks, people were more concerned about aquatic life than multi-billion euro engineering. Typical Venice, equal parts drama and distraction. But Mose isn't just a gate, it's a gamble. Started in the early 2000s, the project quickly ballooned in cost and controversy. Corruption scandals erupted, politicians were arrested, construction slowed. Delays piled up like driftwood during a storm. For years, Venetians referred to it as the underwater money pit, and who could blame them? Billions spent, and the water kept rising. Then, in 2020, something unexpected happened. It worked. The first real test came in October of that year, when a high tide threatened to flood the city again. Mose was activated, the gates rose, and Venice stayed dry. Locals cheered. Tourists posted celebratory selfies. Engineers sighed in relief. After decades of ridicule, the beast had finally stirred and done its job. You walk along the shoreline now, waves lapping at the sand like a dog sniffing at a closed door. Somewhere beneath your feet, a line of steel slumbers. It's an impressive thing, no doubt. But no one's calling it a miracle, not yet. Because Mose isn't perfect. It takes hours to activate. It wasn't designed for daily use, only emergencies, and it can't handle long-term sea level rise, just short spikes. If the sea keeps rising, eventually the gates would have to stay closed permanently, cutting off natural flow into the lagoon. That would turn Venice's delicate ecosystem into a stagnant puddle. Fish would vanish, sediment would pile up, the water would rot. That's the scholarly debate raging now. Some experts argue Mose bought Venice time, a century maybe. Others say it's a short-term fix for a long-term crisis. One side praises the design as genius, the other calls it a band-aid on a bullet wound. Meanwhile, the sea keeps knocking. You visit a nearby maintenance site where one of the gates has been brought up for inspection. It's massive, dented in places, stained by salt and time. Engineers crawl over it like ants on a sunken spaceship. One explains that each gate must be serviced regularly, lifted, cleaned, checked for wear. Salt water is a patient assassin. It corrodes everything, and once a gate starts rusting, it doesn't stop. There's a strange beauty to it, though. All that effort, all that steel, all those minds working together to fight something as old and relentless as the sea. It's almost mythological, like trying to hold back Poseidon with a really well-timed exhale. You sit now at the edge of the pier, watching as a small maintenance boat zips across the water. In the distance, the skyline of Venice shimmers like something remembered rather than real. The domes of San Marco, the jagged teeth of the Campanile, the endless terraces and towers, all of it floating for now. And you wonder, will it last? Maybe. If the gates rise when they need to, if the maintenance crews never miss a check, if the sea stays within the range of predictability, if all the ifs line up just right, or maybe Venice will do what it's always done, outlast the predictions. Not by resisting the future, but by flowing with it. Like water, like tide, like the gates themselves, rising and falling, always in motion, always bracing for the next wave. You step off the Vaporetto and onto the quiet stones of the San Polo district, where the buildings seem to rise from the canal like dreams that forgot how to fade. There's a stillness here that feels older than silence, like the buildings are holding their breath. They should have crumbled. They should have tilted and slouched and slipped beneath the waves by now. But instead they remain, majestic, stubborn, and ridiculously heavy. Palaces made of stone and marble sitting on waterlogged mud. It doesn't make sense. And yet, here they are. You stare up at a particularly grand facade, the Cadoro, the Golden House. Its delicate Gothic tracery glows in the late afternoon light, like a lace doily carved out of limestone and hubris. It's one of the city's most iconic buildings, and if you didn't know better, you'd think it was built on bedrock. But you do know better. You know that this palace, like every other building in Venice, is built on a swamp, and the fact that it hasn't sunk into it is kind of a miracle. Or more accurately, it's an engineering masterclass that started 1,000 years ago and still hasn't quite stopped. Let's break it down. Beneath the Car d'Oro, and every other palace, church and home in Venice, is a forest. Not the leafy kind. A man-made forest of wooden piles driven deep into the mud and clay of the lagoon. Thousands of them. Each building required a dense grid of timber poles to distribute its weight across the most stable layers of sediment. They're not dug in so much as hammered in, with the kind of effort that suggests someone really didn't want their house to float away. And yet, you can't build stone on wood and expect it to last, right? Wrong. Because here's the trick. The lagoon's brackish water is anaerobic, oxygen deprived, which means the wood never rots. In fact, it petrifies over time. The waterlogged timber becomes stone-like, hardening into an unnatural permanence, so the foundations don't decay, they stabilise, and the buildings above somehow stay put. You walk through a quiet campo now, eyeing a row of palazzi that lean just slightly to one side, like they've had one too many Negronis. It's charming until you remember they're several hundred years old and weigh roughly as much as small mountains. Still, they haven't collapsed. They've simply adapted. Everything in Venice has. Your quirky fact for today: many Venetian palaces were designed with their ground floor half submerged, never meant for regular living. That level, the androne, was for storage, boat access, or servants. The real action happened upstairs, on the piano nobile, or noble floor. This middle level had the best light, the highest ceilings, and the most elaborate decoration. Why? Because no one wanted to throw dinner parties at sea level when the sea had a tendency to drop in unannounced. You climb a stone staircase now, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and enter the second floor of a museum palazzo. The ceilings soar above you, painted with clouds and cherubs, and at least one suspiciously muscular saint. The floors are made of marble mosaic, intricate and dizzying. You notice that everything feels off-kilter, slightly sloped, gently warped, like the building is perpetually shrugging. It's not your imagination. These old palaces settle unevenly over time, and the floors quietly follow gravity's lead. But how did these massive structures, made of stone, often topped with heavy brick roofs, actually stay upright in mud? Scholars still argue over that. Some say it's the sheer density of the pile foundations. An average palace sits on 10,000 to 12,000 timber poles. Others credit the lime mortar used in construction, which expands slightly in damp conditions, helping seal joints against moisture. Still others point to the clever distribution of weight across thick exterior walls, keeping pressure off the centre and reducing stress on the foundations. And then there are the bricks. Not just any bricks, but special Venetian ones. Longer, flatter, more porous, designed to absorb and release moisture without cracking. These bricks are practically alive. They breathe with the city, swelling and shrinking with the tide. They know how to wait. You exit the museum and cross another canal, this one lined with smaller houses. Their facades a patchwork of fading paint and trailing ivy. Some look barely held together, with windows at odd angles and door frames that have clearly lost their square. And yet, no scaffolding, no caution tape, just life continuing inside, clinking cutlery, muffled voices, a dog barking 3 floors up. It's all still working, even if it looks like it shouldn't. Venice is like that friend who's always 5 minutes late, a little dishevelled, and somehow still manages to pull off the best dinner party of the year. Nothing is perfect, but nothing needs to be. Now, not everything in Venice is a success story. There are buildings that have collapsed, facades that have fallen into the canal with a splash and a collective gasp. Restoration is constant. You pass scaffolding on almost every block, sometimes for decades at a time. Cracks are patched, foundations reinforced, floors rebuilt from underneath. And the cost? Astronomical. But the alternative is letting it all slide back into the lagoon. There's a growing movement among engineers and conservationists to study the city not just as a monument, but as a living lab. Venice is teaching the world how to build with water, not against it. Floating cities, flood-resistant housing, amphibious infrastructure, All of it is borrowing ideas from here. From these leaning palaces, these petrified pilings, these stubborn slabs of marble that refuse to give up. You wander back toward the Grand Canal where the Cadoro gleams in the afternoon light, its windows throwing reflections into the water like polished knives. It doesn't look like it should be possible. A palace like that should be cracked, crooked, or long since abandoned. But it isn't. It's open, alive, steady. And maybe that's the most surprising thing about Venice. For all its rot and ruin, its flooding and fragility, it remains deeply, defiantly intact. Not untouched, never that, but held together by something stronger than concrete. Memory, ingenuity, and a refusal to disappear. You pause by the water, watching a small boat glide by, its wake nudging gently against the stone steps. The palace beside you doesn't flinch. It has survived worse. It will survive again. You run your hand along a brick wall just above the canal, fingertips catching on crumbling mortar and the faint crust of white crystals clinging to the surface like frost. It's not frost, though. It's salt. A delicate film of it, left behind by the lagoon's brackish breath. At first glance, it seems harmless, maybe even kind of pretty. But make no mistake, salt is Venice's slowest, pettiest enemy. It doesn't storm in with waves or thunder. It just waits, creeps, seeps, and then, one flake at a time, it begins to destroy. It's called salt efflorescence, a term that sounds like it should be a new perfume, but is actually the bane of Venice's architectural existence. Here's how it works. Seawater rises through the porous bricks and stones via capillary action, that same weird, clingy behaviour that makes paper towels soak up spills. When the water evaporates, it leaves behind the salt it carried. That salt then crystallises inside the walls, and as those crystals grow, they expand. Slowly, incessantly, and with just enough pressure to shatter mortar, fracture brick, and peel away layers of plaster like sunburned skin. You look closer and see the evidence everywhere. Powdery streaks like ghostly veins running up centuries-old facades, discoloured patches where paint used to be, cracks around archways. Even the graffiti seems to flake and blur like the wall is trying to shrug off its own skin. Venice doesn't crumble in dramatic chunks. It exfoliates. You're in the Castello district now, where the buildings lean a little harder and the tourists thin out. The decay here is more honest, less disguised by fresh coats of paint and scaffolding. You walk past an abandoned warehouse, its brickwork pockmarked and flaking, the lower rows eaten away by the persistent kiss of the tide. A faded sign warns visitors not to lean against the wall, which feels like a polite way of saying, this entire building is being held together by mood and memory. Here's your quirky fact. Salt isn't just eating the walls, it's changing the city's colour. That soft pinkish hue you see on so many facades, that's not just pigment. It's the result of centuries of mineral bloom reacting with plaster and brick. It's literally the sea painting the city in its own palette. Romantic, right? Right up until you realise it's also hollowing the place out from the inside. So why not just wash it off? Build stronger walls, seal everything in plastic? Well, it's complicated. You see, Venice was built with materials meant to breathe. The old bricks and stones expand and contract with humidity, allowing moisture to escape and keeping the interior relatively dry. Seal them too tightly, and you trap the moisture inside, accelerating the very damage you were trying to prevent. Waterproofing, ironically, can make things worse. It's like trying to stop a leaky pipe by stuffing it full of cement. You don't fix the problem, you just move it somewhere else. This tension between protecting the past and not making it worse is at the heart of conservation debates across the city. Engineers and artisans argue over lime plaster versus modern sealants. Some insist on sticking with traditional materials, trusting what's worked for centuries. Others want to embrace new science, with nano coatings and chemical barriers. The only consensus: nothing is perfect. Every solution has a cost. Every intervention is a risk. You duck into a tiny courtyard now, shaded and still, where a crumbling wellhead sits like a forgotten shrine. A few bricks nearby are split clean in half, as if someone pressed their thumbs into a biscuit and the whole thing gave way. That's salt again. Growing inside, pushing out, slow-motion violence. It's not just the buildings either. Salt gets into everything. Wooden beams warp. Iron rebar rusts. The elegant marble columns outside churches. They sometimes crack from within. veins of salt widening like hairline fractures in bone. Even the mosaics inside San Marco's basilica, those shimmering gilded masterpieces, have battled salt intrusion over the centuries. Think about that. The very water that surrounds the city, protects it, defines it, is also very patiently trying to murder it. And Venice can't keep it out, not entirely. The city needs water to survive. Economically, ecologically, structurally. It's not like you can build a moat around it and keep the sea out. That's the paradox. The thing that gives Venice life is also what's slowly taking it away. One tide at a time, one crystal at a time. There's a strange beauty in the decay, though. You notice it as you walk past a small chapel, its walls streaked with pale streaks, the stone steps rounded by years of wear, a rusted iron lantern hanging at a tilt like it's leaning into the past. Everything looks like it's fading, but it's a controlled fade. Not abandonment, patina. And maybe that's what Venice is best at. Not avoiding decay, but curating it. Making the ruin look intentional. Elegant, even. The peeling paint becomes texture. The cracks become character. The salt, for all its malice, becomes part of the aesthetic. Tourists take photos of the decay without realizing it's slowly winning. You pass a group of conservation students now, gathered around a section of wall. They're examining the salt crusts with tiny brushes and glass vials. One of them is explaining how the direction of the wind affects evaporation patterns, how the west-facing facades suffer more because of sun exposure. It's a masterclass in slow damage. They take notes, they debate, they sound hopeful, and that's the quiet fight happening all over Venice right now. Not just against flooding or tourism or time, but against salt, the invisible siege, the one no one really notices until a piece of cornice falls off and lands in a canal with a splash. You round a corner and return to the Grand Canal, where the water glows with late light, and the buildings look serene, timeless, defiant. But now you see the whiteness creeping up their walls. You see the erosion around their foundations. You see what most people miss. And still, Venice stands. Maybe it's not about winning against the salt. Maybe it's about enduring it, letting the city absorb the damage, wear it, age with it, without ever giving in. Maybe that's what gives Venice its strange strength. It doesn't resist decay. It dances with it. You're inside a palace now, standing in a high-ceilinged room that smells faintly of damp wood, aged linen, and that impossible-to-pinpoint aroma of history. There's light coming through the tall windows, reflected off the canal below, and it pools across the mosaic floor like melted silver. A velvet armchair sits to one side, a chandelier dangles above, and on the far end of the room, just past the ornate archway, there's a door that doesn't quite fit the surroundings. It's wooden, plain, and half hidden behind a curtain. That's the bathroom. And tonight, my friend, we're going to talk about plumbing. Because, yes, Venice has plumbing. And of course it's weird. You open that wooden door and step into what can best be described as a hybrid between a medieval closet and a theatrical confession booth. The toilet sits on a pedestal, like it's auditioning for a minor role in a 17th century opera. No flush handle, no chrome, just a seat and a mysterious chute leading downward into what you can only hope is a well-organised underworld. Venetian bathrooms, particularly in the historic buildings, are feats of quiet ingenuity. They've evolved over centuries, not because they had access to fancy technology, but because they had to evolve. When you live in a city that floods regularly and doesn't have a centralised sewer system, you get creative with waste disposal. The early Venetians didn't have modern plumbing, obviously. They used chamber pots. Those pots, once full, were either emptied into the canals, into small cesspits beneath their homes, or, in the case of the wealthy, handed to servants who would discreetly row them away under cover of darkness. Smell something strange drifting through the fog at night. That might have been aristocratic poop on the move. Eventually, as the city grew and habits improved, more sophisticated systems emerged. The classic Venetian toilet, especially in older palaces, is gravity-fed. Waste goes down a chute into an underground Pozzo Nero or black well. When the tide rises, the well fills. When the tide falls, it drains back into the canal, carrying everything with it. Think of it as a natural flush. Kind of horrifying, kind of brilliant, and definitely a product of its environment. Here's your quirky fact for the day. Some of these old toilets still work. Quietly, efficiently, stubbornly ignoring centuries of modern plumbing standards. And sometimes, when it floods, the tide reverses the whole process. Backflow. The phrase explosive plumbing wasn't coined in Venice, but it really could have been. Now, in more modern buildings and hotels, things are different. Some have septic tanks under the foundations, which are pumped out by the city's waste services. Others connect to one of the limited sewer lines that run beneath parts of the city, tiny, winding, and often overwhelmed. Venice does have a wastewater system, but it's patchy, ancient, and basically a patchwork of fixes built on top of previous patches. You leave the palace bathroom and step into a stairwell that winds down toward the canal. The stairs are worn smooth, carved with the heels of generations. At the bottom, you find yourself in a room half below water level, once a boat entrance now sealed. This was likely where servants dumped waste discreetly, letting the tide whisk it away like some judgmental roommate with a mop. A rusted iron hook still hangs on the wall, maybe for tying up boats, maybe for hauling something you'd rather not think about. This room tells a story most tourists never see, how Venetians lived with their environment instead of trying to conquer it. Everything in the house was shaped by water, kitchens elevated, toilets designed for tidal cycles. Even bath water was once collected rainwater, stored in massive stone cisterns under courtyards. You pass one of those cisterns now, peering into its cool, dark centre. It still works. The city depended on rain, not aqueducts, for drinking water for most of its history. The sea was too salty, the canals too filthy. So they built massive underground reservoirs, lined with clay and sand, filtering rain through layers until it was clear enough to drink. Clever, right? Like Brita, but medieval. There's a scholarly debate about how hygienic Venetian living actually was during the Renaissance. Some argue the city was a festering cesspool, a ticking time bomb of disease barely masked by perfume and pride. Others insist it was cleaner than many of its land-based rivals, precisely because the tides helped clear the canals twice a day. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere in the middle. Venice wasn't clean, but it wasn't helpless either. You head back outside now, walking past a maintenance worker crouched by a drain, poking at it with a long metal rod. These guys are Venice's unsung heroes. The canal scrapers, the pipe unblockers, the folks who go elbow deep into the city's literal underbelly so that visitors can take romantic gondola rides without realizing they're floating above what used to be a liquid landfill. And even with modern plumbing slowly making its way into more homes, Venice still faces an uphill battle. Pipes freeze in winter, pumps burn out. The tide doesn't care about your fancy fixtures. Some bathrooms require electric pumps to push waste up and out, because gravity only works in your favour when you're above sea level, which here is never guaranteed. You duck into a cafe, mostly to warm up and use their bathroom. It's compact, immaculate. The toilet flushes with a button that triggers a low mechanical hum. That's the pump at work, pulling your offering through a maze of tubes and filters before releasing it into the wider system. Or, let's be honest, a canal that looks pretty but has its secrets. You wash your hands in a basin made of pink marble and glance out the window. The canal is calm. A gondola slides past. Two tourists are posing for photos near a bridge. They have no idea that just beneath them, beneath the stone and plaster and ancient beauty, there's a delicate digestive system trying very, very hard not to backfire. And maybe that's the miracle of Venice. Not just that it's beautiful or historic, but that it works. Sort of. Enough. It flushes. It flows. It breathes. It leaks. It repairs itself constantly, like a stubborn old body that refuses to give up just because the plumbing's a mess. You step back into the street, grateful your shoes are still dry, and a little more respectful of the fact that this city doesn't just float, it functions. Against the odds, against the tide, against reason itself. You're crossing a narrow bridge, one of hundreds, maybe thousands, that tie Venice together like stitches in a floating tapestry. But this one's different. You can feel it before you even reach the middle. Something colder, quieter. There's no street vendor nearby, no musician with an accordion, no trail of pigeons demanding breadcrumbs, just stone, water, and something final. This is the Bridge of Sighs, and it's not here to charm you. Unlike the more glamorous Rialto or the sweeping Academia, this bridge is almost modest. White limestone, covered, narrow, and enclosed on both sides, with only two small windows carved into its sides. It connects the Doge's palace on one side with the old prison on the other, and if you're starting to put the pieces together, yes, This bridge was the last view of Venice that prisoners saw before vanishing into the cells. The sighs weren't poetic, they were real. You step onto the bridge, now part of a carefully managed tourist circuit, and pause in the middle. The windows are narrow, barred, and slightly fogged with time. Through one of them, you see the canal below, and beyond it, the domes of San Giorgio Maggiore rising across the water. It's breathtaking, but in a way that doesn't comfort. It aches. You can imagine someone in chains standing here, catching a final glimpse of the sky, of the lagoon, of freedom. Exhaling a sigh that has somehow echoed through the centuries. Inside, the bridge feels claustrophobic. Arched ceilings, stone floor, no decoration. It's not meant for lingering. It's a corridor between judgment and punishment. On one side, the lavish halls of the Doge's palace, where justice was dispensed in rooms lined with gold. On the other, cold stone cells, some no larger than closets. The contrast is brutal, deliberate. A final slap of reality for anyone who once thought they'd talk their way out of trouble. And the Doge's palace? That's a whole other story. You pass back through it now, opulent, theatrical, absurd in its extravagance. Everything inside is designed to impress or intimidate. Frescoes of judgment days, massive council chambers with ceilings that seem to hover without support, portraits of stoic rulers glaring down from the walls. This was the centre of power, the seat of the Venetian Republic, and the place where decisions about life, death, and exile were made with all the ceremony of a well-rehearsed opera. The courtrooms were particularly theatrical. Accused criminals, especially political ones, were tried here, often without ever seeing the faces of their accusers. The Council of Ten, Venice's famously secretive ruling group, operated like a Renaissance version of an intelligence agency, complete with informants, spies, and anonymous tip lines. You could drop a note into a lion's mouth, a literal carved lion head attached to the wall, accusing your neighbour of treason or tax evasion. The council would take it from there. Quirky fact, some of those lion mailboxes still exist. You can find one tucked into the outer wall of the Doge's palace, fanged and weathered, its expression halfway between noble and deeply judgmental. It's empty now, probably. The bridge you just crossed isn't merely a path, it's a message. Venice, the Republic, wanted you to feel the weight of justice. Even in punishment, there was performance. The prisoners may have been anonymous, but their final walk was part of the city's story. The Bridge of Sighs became a symbol, not just of loss, but of the elaborate machinery Venice built to control, to judge, and to isolate. And of course, leave it to later centuries to turn all this tragedy into romance. The name Bridge of Sighs didn't appear until much later, probably the 19th century, when poets and novelists got their hands on it. Lord Byron helped cement the myth in English-speaking imaginations, writing, "I stood in Venice, on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand." People assumed it referred to lovers sighing as they passed underneath in gondolas, rather than prisoners sighing before the door slammed shut forever. Classic misread. Beautiful, though. And now, from this very bridge, you look out at the gondolas drifting below. Tourists lean in close for selfies, laughing. One couple kisses as their boat passes beneath. Do they know what this place meant? Probably not. But Venice has always thrived on layers. Beauty on top of tragedy, sunlight on top of rot, music echoing over silence. You move through the prison wing next, stone cells with doors barely high enough to pass through upright. The walls are covered with names, scratched in centuries ago, messages, initials, tallies. You press your palm against the cool stone and feel nothing, but you imagine the heat of lives that spent decades in here, waiting. These were not death sentences, always. But they were disappearances, and Venice was good at making people vanish. There's scholarly debate about just how many prisoners used the Bridge of Sighs. Some records suggest it was mainly for elite criminals, those deemed dangerous or important enough to be locked away with formality. Others say it was used regularly for all sorts of offenders, from murderers to tax cheats. There's also some disagreement about the conditions. Were they truly brutal or relatively humane by Renaissance standards? The answer, as always in Venice, lies somewhere between myth and meticulous record-keeping. You leave the prison through a side corridor and emerge once again into the light. The water below sparkles like it hasn't seen the shadow of suffering. Boats come and go. Bells ring somewhere across the rooftops. A breeze lifts the edge of your jacket, and behind you, the bridge stands silent, unchanged. It's strange, isn't it? A place built to contain pain ends up as one of the most photographed spots in the city. Postcards, posters, wedding shoots. People float under it thinking of love, while above them, once someone may have thought only of time and darkness. You sit now on the edge of the canal, legs dangling just above the green water. The sun's low, painting everything gold. You stare at the bridge, its white stone glowing against the shadows behind it. And you think about all the sighs this city has collected, not just from prisoners, but from lovers, from artists, from engineers staring at cracked foundations, from residents watching the water rise year after year. Venice hears them all, and the bridge, it still holds them. You're standing in a crowd of masked strangers, the air thick with perfume, velvet, and the flicker of candlelight reflecting off sequins. Music drifts from somewhere nearby, a harpsichord, faint and elegant, plucking out a melody that feels both ancient and a little mischievous. A woman in a gold-trimmed border mask passes by, nodding in your direction, revealing nothing but her eyes. No one speaks your name here. No one asks who you are, because this is Venice during Carnival, and identity has officially taken the night off. Forget everything you think you know about festivals. Venice didn't invent partying, but it certainly elevated it to an art form. And tonight, you've walked straight into the city's most surreal intersection of engineering and illusion. Carnival is more than just celebration. It's a living, breathing infrastructure of anonymity, indulgence, and control. Underneath all the music and feathers lies one of the strangest forms of civic engineering you'll ever see: social architecture. You follow the crowd down a narrow alley and into a courtyard glowing with torchlight. Laughter echoes against the stone. Masked revelers spill out of doorways like spilled wine. Everything's dramatic, theatrical, a little slippery. No one walks, they glide. And everywhere you look, faces are hidden. White masks with hooked noses, beaded visors, painted lips frozen in sly little grins. It should feel eerie. It doesn't. It feels fair, equal, liberated. In a city shaped by class, reputation, and centuries of political theatre, Carnival was the one time everything reset. The mask, quite literally, levelled the playing field. The rich could mingle with the poor. Servants could impersonate nobles. Lovers could sneak glances they'd never dare by daylight. Even the Doge, the top political figure in the Venetian Republic, sometimes walked among his people in disguise, not to spy, but to be one of them, just for a night. That's your quirky fact. The masks weren't just decorative, they were institutional. Venice sanctioned Carnival. It was built into the calendar, regulated by law, and supported by a booming industry of tailors, musicians, and mask makers. Even the mask designs were codified. The bolter, that square-jawed white mask with the prominent nose, was standard issue unrecognizability. Paired with a tricorn hat and a black cloak, it was the VPN of the 18th century. Legal anonymity, courtesy of fashion. And yes, it was legal. For months out of the year, Venetians were allowed to wear masks in public, in the streets, at church, in government buildings. There were rules, sure. No carrying weapons while masked, no gambling unless inside designated establishments, no impersonating clergy. That was an awkward week. But the general principle was clear. When the mask was on, the person underneath didn't matter. But the city didn't just allow this strange social reshuffling, it needed it. The Venetian Republic was a state obsessed with appearances. Power was wielded politely, ruthlessly, and always behind closed doors. Carnival was the release valve, a structured chaos, a safe rebellion. Everyone played by the rules, so they could afford to break them later, briefly, beautifully, and without consequence. You drift now into a candlelit hall where dancers move in perfect circles, silk skirts brushing against polished floors. The room feels both ancient and alive, like a memory that refuses to fade. A masked couple spins past you, and for a moment you forget where, or when, you are. Carnival doesn't feel like nostalgia. It feels like a portal, a reminder that every city needs a little chaos, a little role-play to stay sane. And here's where the engineering comes in, because this wasn't just a party. This was urban planning with a theatrical twist. The entire city adapted for Carnivale. Stages were built in public squares. Temporary bridges were laid over canals to handle increased foot traffic. Pop-up theatres appeared inside palaces. Even the gondolas were fitted with extra cushions and lanterns for late-night returns home, possibly while trying to remember where home was. The city transformed itself into a stage set, ready for weeks of spectacle. There's scholarly debate about just how democratic this masked freedom really was. Some historians argue that Carnival reinforced the existing social order, that everyone played at equality, but still returned to their real roles when the masks came off. Others believe it genuinely destabilized things, giving voice to the silenced, creating moments of unexpected truth. There are even records of citizens submitting anonymous political critiques during Carnival, wrapped in jokes or double entendre, protected by their costumes. One thing is certain, Venice excelled at creating controlled environments where emotion could be expressed, but not weaponized. A kind of social sandbox, if you will, and nowhere was that clearer than during this masked season. You walk now into a quieter side street, the party echoing behind you, the masks thinning out. A few costumed revellers lean against a wall, sharing wine from a clay bottle, laughing at something only they understand. Someone sings a soft tune, off-key but haunting. The wind picks up, rustling fabric and whispering secrets against the stones. There's something oddly intimate about the whole thing, not just the masks, but what they reveal. You realise as you step past yet another hooded figure that Carnival isn't about hiding who you are. It's about stepping out of who you're supposed to be, just for a little while. It's not escape, it's suspension. And isn't that the story of Venice in a way? A city suspended between land and sea, faith and corruption, beauty and decay. Carnival is Venice distilled. Absurd, brilliant, controlled chaos wrapped in velvet. You find yourself back in St. Mark's Square now, the clock tower glowing above you, and a fresh wave of dancers spilling onto the flagstones. The air smells of wax, roses, and too much perfume. A masked figure brushes past you and whispers, "You look familiar," before disappearing into the crowd. You don't answer. That's the point. Because here, tonight, no one's trying to be real. They're just trying to feel something, free, seen, forgotten, desired, lost, like the city itself, always slipping between identities, always performing, always ready for its next act. And as the bells chime midnight and the masks keep dancing, you wonder, what would your mask look like? And what would you do if no one knew your name? You're sitting on the stone edge of a canal, legs dangling just above the green water, watching the reflections tremble. The scene is so peaceful, so picturesque, it feels like time itself is resting. But in your head, a question's been stirring since the day you arrived. Is Venice really sinking? You've seen the headlines, the climate reports, the apocalyptic documentaries with ominous music and CGI floods. But now, staring at the tranquil surface, the ancient buildings still standing tall in all their faded drama, you're not so sure. Is it sinking, or is something else happening entirely? Let's unpack that. First of all, yes, Venice has sunk. That's not up for debate. Since the city was founded over 1,500 years ago, it's estimated to have dropped somewhere between 20 to 25 centimetres, or roughly 8 to 10 inches. That's not dramatic in everyday terms, but in Venice, where a few centimetres can mean the difference between a dry cafe and a submerged one, it matters. The sinking, subsidence, if you want to sound scholarly, was made worse in the 20th century when the city began extracting fresh water from underground aquifers. Basically, they pulled the rug out from under themselves. The ground compacted. Venice slouched. When they realised what was happening, they stopped the pumping. The subsidence slowed. But the water? The water didn't get the memo. Because while the city has been settling, the sea has been rising, quietly, steadily, and without any intention of stopping. Here's your quirky fact for today. There's an official measuring station in Venice that's been recording sea level since 1872. That makes it one of the oldest continuous tide records in the world. And the numbers don't lie. The Adriatic has risen by more than 30 centimetres in the last century. Combine that with natural sinking, and you get a city that's about half a metre lower than it used to be. That's enough to make a typical alta go from rare nuisance to seasonal menace. But is Venice still sinking? That's where the debate begins. Some scientists say yes. Very slowly, very subtly, the islands are still settling into the soft sediment of the lagoon. They point to satellite data and GPS measurements showing millimetre-level shifts each year. Others argue that the city has reached a sort of equilibrium, that most of the sinking damage was done decades ago, and what's happening now is almost entirely due to sea level rise. Still others suggest something more nuanced. Venice isn't sinking evenly. Some areas, particularly the outer islands, are dropping faster than others. Some bell towers are tilting. Some palazzi are shifting. It's like watching a dinner table sag one leg at a time. Not enough to flip the lasagna, but enough to make you anxious. You wander now into Dorsoduro, one of the quieter districts, and pass by a church whose steps lead directly into the canal. At high tide, they disappear completely. Locals joke that the church baptizes you whether you want it to or not. But the stones tell a more serious story. You can see the water lines etched across the facade like tree rings, each one a tide, each one a reminder. Scholars have started calling this phenomenon relative sea level rise, because it's not just about the ocean climbing, it's about the land shrinking. Venice is caught in both directions, being pulled down and pushed up slowly and relentlessly. But here's the twist. The sinking isn't even the biggest problem, it's the flooding. You see, Venice could handle being a little lower if the lagoon behaved. But storm surges, unpredictable weather patterns, and stronger winds are turning regular tides into aggressive visitors. The city has gone from facing 10 or 15 flood events a year in the 1960s to well over 60 per year now, and in some bad years, it's over 100. That's one every 3 days, and you thought your landlord was unreliable. That brings us back to the now-activated Mose system, those famous underwater gates that rise during dangerously high tides. So far, Mose has done its job, keeping the city dry when it might otherwise be underwater. But it's a temporary fix, a delay tactic. If the sea keeps rising, eventually the gates will need to close more and more frequently. And when they're closed too often, the lagoon doesn't get flushed out by the tides. Water stagnates, ecosystems break down, Venice can't breathe. You stop at a cafe, one of those slightly tilted ones with a terrace barely above water level, and order a spritz. The waiter shrugs when you ask about the flooding. It comes, it goes, he says. We lift the tables. You glance down and notice little wedges under each table leg. Adaptation, Venetian style. You take your drink and sit by the water. Boats hum past. The canal glitters. A local glides by in a small workboat, navigating by muscle memory. If Venice is sinking, nobody told him. He's lived here all his life. He remembers floods, sure, but he also remembers ice skating on frozen canals in the winters of the 1980s. That doesn't happen anymore. Winters are warmer, the weather's different, the water's higher, but the rhythm of life, still flowing. And here's what makes Venice such a strange, compelling case. It exists in a constant state of negotiation, with nature, with memory, with change. It doesn't resist sinking, it learns how to live with it. The foundations shift, the bricks crack, the facades peel, but the city doesn't fall, it adjusts. That's the real engineering marvel. Not just the piles and the stones, but the psychology of survival. You finish your drink and walk along the canal, now catching the sound of church bells across the water. They echo soft and solemn, as if the city is clearing its throat before saying something important. And maybe it is. Maybe what Venice is saying, beneath the floods and the data and the sighs of engineers, is, I'm still here. You pause, look down at the canal's edge, and imagine the city 200 years from now. Will people still gather in these cafes? Will gondolas still glide past? Will someone else sit where you're sitting now, wondering the same things? Maybe. If the city continues to adapt, if the world listens, if the water shows a little mercy, or maybe not. But for now, Venice holds, not dry, not steady, but afloat, both literally and metaphorically, a city that may or may not be sinking, but is absolutely refusing to disappear. You're suiting up in neoprene in the back of a workshop that smells like river mud and wet rope, and already your toes are cold. The light filtering in through the high windows is grey, soft, and just a little grimy, as if the lagoon air has stained the sunlight on its way in. You've signed up for an unusual kind of tour today, not one with wine tastings or baroque music, but one that dives beneath the surface, quite literally. Welcome to the hidden world of underwater archaeology in Venice. A strange, soggy treasure hunt where the past sleeps just inches below the silt. You follow your guide, a marine archaeologist named Julia, down a narrow alley toward the canal, passing a pile of rusted tools and a row of plastic bins filled with muddy pottery shards. She's already halfway into her wetsuit, explaining casually that Venice has as much history under the water as above it. People think it's just buildings, she says, tugging on a glove. But this entire city is layered, and some of the most interesting layers are submerged. You slip into the canal like a curious seal, heart thudding as the cold seeps through. The water isn't crystal clear like in the travel brochures. It's murky, greenish-brown, and filled with centuries of microscopic debris. But once your eyes adjust, you begin to see shapes, shadows beneath the silt, outlines of stone, wood, maybe even brick. Julia signals and leads you forward. Venice was built by layering platforms of wood and stone over natural islands, but those layers shifted, collapsed, sunk. Add in centuries of trade, war and weather, and you've got a lagoon littered with the forgotten. Boats that never made it home, staircases that slipped below the tide, foundations of buildings that predate the city's official founding, and sometimes, if you're lucky, objects dropped by accident, a silver spoon, a coin, a ring. Time capsules sealed in mud. You pass beneath a small bridge, its underside slimy with algae, and drift into a wider canal. Julia points to a dark lump half buried in the mud. An old bricola, one of the wooden poles used to mark the navigable paths of the lagoon. This one's ancient, petrified, and slowly being eaten by tiny sea creatures. She brushes off some silt to reveal carved notches, likely used to measure tide levels in the pre-digital days. It's not flashy, but it tells a story. A system of control, of prediction, of a city watching the water like a moody roommate. Quirky fact. In 2019, divers discovered a 13th century shipwreck buried in the lagoon just meters from the city's edge. Not a massive galley or glamorous treasure ship, just a small merchant vessel, forgotten, preserved in mud, its planks held together with iron nails and a little luck. It was carrying amphorae, some intact, some broken, likely filled with wine or olive oil. The wreck was so well preserved that researchers described it as a Venetian Pompeii, but wetter. And it had been there, undisturbed, for over 700 years. You push deeper now into a canal that's been closed to regular boat traffic, a space used by researchers. Below you, fragments of tile crunch softly under your fins. Julia signals again and leads you to something half buried in the bank. A staircase, submerged. You can see the stone steps clearly, descending from what used to be a house entrance. Now, they lead nowhere. Or maybe they lead back. This was once a palazzo. Now, it's a ruin. But even ruins in Venice have style. This is the strange joy of underwater archaeology here. It's not just about digging up gold or finding the lost treasure of Marco Polo. Spoiler, that doesn't exist. It's about documenting how the city changed, where it expanded, where it contracted, where it literally fell apart. These lost staircases and submerged doorways aren't failures. They're pages in a living diary. You rise to the surface for a breath, gulping air that smells of brine and diesel, and float for a moment beneath a crumbling facade. Above you, tourists pass, completely unaware of the ghost architecture below their feet. You wonder what else is down here? Hidden, rotting, resisting? There's a scholarly debate going on right now about whether we've even scratched the surface, so to speak, of what Venice has buried in its lagoon. Some argue that large portions of the early city, especially pre-10th century settlements, lie undiscovered beneath sediment layers. Others believe most of it was dismantled and reused, its materials cannibalized by later generations. The problem, of course, is that underwater archaeology in Venice is brutally difficult. Visibility is poor, currents are tricky, everything is fragile. It's like trying to rebuild a jigsaw puzzle in a snow globe filled with coffee. Still, researchers keep diving, slowly, carefully, mapping brick patterns, photographing everything before disturbing a single tile. Even something as mundane as a wooden beam can reveal how the city's construction methods evolved, how load-bearing changed, how canals shifted, how builders learned to trick mud into holding still. You haul yourself out of the water, clumsy and dripping, and sit on the stone edge again. Julia peels off her gloves and opens a thermos of coffee. The city is layered, she says, pouring you a cup. People think of history as something behind them. Here, it's also below. You sip, shivering slightly, and glance back at the canal. The surface gives nothing away. It never does. Venice hides its stories in plain sight, in walls, in shadows, and in the silt just below your toes. And maybe that's what makes it so magnetic. Not just the beauty, not just the gondolas and the churches and the carnival masks, but the fact that, underneath all that, there's still more Venice. Sinking, yes. Shifting, yes. But not gone. You stand, warm now, and take one last look into the murk. Somewhere down there is a tile from a forgotten kitchen. A coin dropped during a market brawl. A nail that once held up someone's ceiling. A staircase leading to nowhere and to everything. You wake to the sound of tools. Not jackhammers or drills, but something older, gentler. Wooden mallets, scraping chisels, the rhythmic tap-tap of human hands shaping human history. You follow the noise through a sleepy carl, past shuttered shops and laundry lines until you find the source. A boatyard. More specifically, a schiero. You're standing at the edge of one of Venice's oldest and most sacred workspaces, the place where gondolas are born. There are no signs, no welcome arch. Just a wide, timber-framed yard sloping gently toward the canal, flanked by dark wooden sheds and the unmistakable smell of sawdust and resin. You're in the Schiero di San Travaso, one of the few surviving traditional gondola workshops still operating like it's 1750. If Venice has bones, this is where its ribs are carved. The master carpenter, called a squararolo, emerges from one of the sheds, wiping his hands on a cloth so stained it might be legally considered a historical artifact. He nods to you, then to the gondola skeleton laid out before him. It looks nothing like the graceful black curve you expected, just a framework of rib-like planks, half-finished, raw and skeletal. "They're all a little crooked," he says in Italian, "like the city. That's not just poetic, it's literal. Gondolas are asymmetrical by design. They're longer on one side than the other, and their bottoms curve subtly left, compensating for the fact that the gondolier rose from just one side. If they were symmetrical, they'd spin in circles. Instead, they glide straight, elegant, logical, like engineering dressed in formal wear. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Each gondola is made from 8 different types of wood: oak, fir, cherry, walnut, elm, larch, mahogany, and lime. Why? Because each part needs something different. Flexibility, buoyancy, strength, weight. It's like building a violin the size of a bus, and every part, every curve, every groove is still shaped by hand. No two gondolas are exactly alike. They're more like siblings than twins. You walk closer now, watching as the squararolo leans over a plank, running a chisel across the edge with the patience of someone who's already done this 1,000 times and knows he'll do it 1,000 more. Nearby, a younger apprentice is sanding the forcula, the intricate oarlock that looks more like modern sculpture than boat hardware. It's carved from walnut and shaped to fit the gondolier's rowing style. No two forecaul are exactly the same either. You begin to see that this place isn't just a workshop, it's a shrine to craft. The gondola, after all, isn't just a boat. It's Venice distilled. Long, narrow, elegant, impractical, ancient, mysterious, wildly expensive, and so absurdly iconic it might as well have its own flag. And it's engineered with the kind of obsession usually reserved for Formula One cars. Each gondola is 11 metres long, but only 1.4 metres wide. The hull must weigh precisely 350 kilograms. The stern must sit higher than the bow. The balance must account for a single human standing, rowing, steering, and performing all at once, because a gondolier is also a tour guide, a therapist, a baritone, and occasionally a flirt. And they don't steer with a rudder. They steer with grace, with instinct, with one oar and a knowledge of water so deep it might as well be genetic. You step into one of the completed gondolas resting at the edge of the canal. It rocks gently, the lacquered black surface gleaming like oil. The gondola's curve reflects the skyline behind you. Church domes, bell towers, washing lines. The craftsmanship is so precise it becomes invisible. You don't see the engineering, you feel the result. Stability and instability. This, you realise, is what the whole city is like. Built on contradictions, shaped by adaptation. 1,000-year-old answer to problems that never stop changing. There's a scholarly debate about when exactly the gondola took its current form. Some say the design was finalised in the 17th century. Others argue it evolved gradually through the 18th and 19th centuries. What's clear is that by the time photography arrived, the gondola already looked much like it does now. Long, black, perfectly poised, almost smug in its elegance. And black, by the way, is not optional. It's required by law. There are exceptions, but they're rare and symbolic, like the traghetto gondolas used to ferry passengers across the Grand Canal in places without bridges. Those are plain, utilitarian, and sometimes even a little shabby. But the private gondola, the one carrying tourists and lovers and lost souls at midnight, that one's a work of art, and must be painted black, a throwback to a 16th century law meant to curb showy displays of wealth. You thank the Squararolo and step back onto the dock, watching as he lifts the ferro, the ornamental iron prow, into place on another gondola. It's not just for looks, it balances the weight of the gondolier in the back. The 6 stylized prongs on the front represent Venice's 6 districts. The curved blade represents the Grand Canal, and the entire piece, usually made of stainless steel or brass, is a symbol of both function and flair. Like everything here. You wander down to the edge of the boatyard and watch as an older gondolier approaches in his freshly polished ride. He's standing with one foot on the edge, one hand on the oar, posture perfect. He nods, steps off, and lets the boat drift slightly before catching it again with a gentle tug on the forecollar. It's choreography. It's muscle memory. It's years of practice disguised as ease. And you start to see how the city itself has trained its people to be engineers without blueprints. Every carpenter, every boat builder, every gondolier, everyone who can walk a wobbly bridge with groceries balanced in one hand and an umbrella in the other. Venice has raised generations of people who adapt as naturally as they breathe, who know how to lean when the world shifts, who know instinctively how to row a crooked boat in a straight line. You step back, the smell of wood and salt lingering, and glance once more at the gondola under construction. It's just ribs and planks now, incomplete and vulnerable. But give it time, it'll glide soon enough, smooth as silk, strong as memory, built to float, forever. You're standing in the shadow of a church, one of the hundreds scattered across Venice like ancient punctuation marks, commas, ellipses, exclamation points in stone. This one isn't grand like San Marco or towering like the Frari. It's quiet, tucked into a sleepy square where pigeons outnumber people, and time seems to move a few seconds slower. The bell tower leans slightly, as if listening for something lost, and the air is thick with incense, dust, and a hint of warm wax. You push the heavy wooden door and step inside. Welcome to the engineering of the sacred. At first glance, the church is simple. Brick walls, wooden beams, a few worn frescoes clinging to the plaster like faded dreams. But look closer, because what's holding this building up isn't just faith or habit. It's centuries of adaptation, improvisation, and quietly brilliant structural hacks designed to keep stone afloat in a city made of mud. The foundations, once again, are wood, driven into the swamp like everything else. But this church, like many others, has had to be adjusted over time. Floors raised, columns shimmed, roofs reinforced with iron beams that didn't exist when Jesus was handing out fish and loaves. And the walls? Don't even get started. If you shine a light just right, you'll see the gentle bow of the bricks, the way they've shifted under the pressure of centuries of tide, gravity, and human breath. And yet, the building stands, wholly by structure, not just by purpose. You move toward the altar now, the marble cool beneath your feet, and pass a side chapel where scaffolding hugs the walls like a cautious friend. A conservator is up on a ladder, dabbing gently at a mural with a Q-tip. Literally. It's restoration at its slowest, most tender pace. Every inch of artwork here is fighting 2 wars, one against time and another against the damp. Salt creeps through stone, mould curls around angels' feet, gold leaf flakes into the air like antique confetti. And yet people keep restoring, keep painting, keep lighting candles. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Venice has more churches per capita than almost any other city in Europe. Around 150 still functioning churches in a place that's barely larger than a medium-sized airport. And many of these churches were built as rival projects, noble families trying to outdo each other with more elaborate domes, taller towers, fancier relics. It was architectural one-upmanship with a spiritual twist. You worship God in that, one patrician might have said, gesturing dismissively across the canal. We just commissioned 3 more apostles and a bonus martyr. But behind the beauty there's engineering. Some of it subtle, some of it ridiculous. Take the domes. Structurally, a dome is a nightmare in a swamp. Heavy, complex, prone to shifting, and yet Venetian architects kept building them, using a mix of brick ribs, light mortar, and often clever tricks to reduce weight. Some domes are hollowed out, Others rest on specially reinforced bases that act like floating rafts. And then there's the way they orient buildings, positioning doorways, altars, even towers to better balance sunlight, wind pressure, and canal flow. You slip into a pew near the back and watch as a local woman kneels, lights a candle, and crosses herself without fanfare. She's done this before. The flame flickers, one small defiance against time, tide, and decay. And above her, high in the rafters, pigeons shift their weight with soft coos, completely at home. There's a scholarly debate that floats through every art history class and architecture conference like a quiet cough. Were Venetian churches really better designed, or just luckier? Some argue the builders were geniuses, adapting Romanesque and Gothic principles to an impossible environment. Others say the ones that collapsed just didn't make it into the guidebooks. Survivorship bias, in stone. What we see today are the miracles, the lucky ones, the ones whose crypts haven't turned into indoor swimming pools. You walk now into the sacristy, where the floors are suspiciously sloped and the cabinets lean just slightly backward. There's a faint smell of mildew. The priest shows you an old manuscript stored in a glass case. Its edges are curled from moisture, the ink faded. He shrugs as if to say, "We've done what we can." And in Venice that's always been enough. Not perfect, not preserved in a museum glass bubble, just enough to survive. Back outside, the bell tower looms above you. It's not quite vertical. Most of them aren't. Venetian bell towers lean, some dramatically, others just enough to make you tilt your head and wonder if it's you or the building. They weren't built to lean, but they've come to wear their tilt like an eccentric uncle wears mismatched socks. Part of the character. The engineering trick? Foundation pads of clay and sand, some of which have settled unevenly over centuries. When one side sinks more than the other, the whole structure tilts. And unless it's falling over, like the Campanile of San Marco did in 1902, they just leave it. You stroll toward that very tower now, the big one, rising over St. Mark's Square like a brick lighthouse. The current version is just over a century old, a near-perfect replica of the original, which crumbled into a dramatic pile of dust on a sunny day without killing a single person. Engineers still debate whether it was poor maintenance, flawed design, or just bad luck. The answer doesn't really matter anymore. They rebuilt it brick by brick, choosing to keep the memory as is, only newer, sturdier. Still slightly tilted. You circle the base, hand on warm stone, and think about all the calculations behind something like this. Wind load, soil compression, resonant frequencies, even bell vibrations. And then you realise, the engineering here isn't about preventing movement, it's about making movement survivable. Because in Venice, nothing is static. The churches shift, the towers lean, the crypts flood. But the rituals continue, the bells still ring, the candles still burn. You sit on the steps across from the church, the evening light slanting golden across the square. Children chase pigeons. A street musician plays Vivaldi, who, by the way, was born in this city and composed for its churches. Tourists take photos of saints they don't recognise. And above them all, domes and crosses cut the sky with grace. It's not just faith that built this place. It's engineering, every bit as sacred. You're walking along the Zattere now, that wide promenade facing the Giudecca Canal, where locals stroll arm in arm and the air smells of sea spray and roasted coffee. On your left, elegant facades, sleepy shops, and old warehouses turned art spaces. On your right, endless blue, broken only by tugboats, ferries, and cruise ships that pass like slow-moving giants. The city breathes easier here. Less crowded, less touristy. Just the soft rhythm of feet on stone and the occasional bell ringing from somewhere you can't quite locate. But even here, with the water glittering and the buildings standing tall, you can feel it. The tension. The sense that something massive is pressing against the edges. That the lagoon, for all its beauty, is also a beast. And behind that, the giant question that keeps architects, engineers, and environmentalists pacing their offices deep into the night. Can Venice actually be saved? It's not a romantic question. It's a logistical one. And to understand the scope of it, you've got to look beyond the canals and into the lagoon itself. Because Venice isn't just a city, it's the centrepiece of a vast, fragile aquatic ecosystem stretching for over 500 square kilometres. A mix of mud flats, salt marshes, tidal channels, barrier islands and shifting sandbanks. It's not static. It's not simple. It's a living, breathing organism, and Venice is just the head peeking above the surface. You hop onto a vaporetto headed toward the Lido, not the glitzy beach resort side, but the quiet, marshier end where few tourists wander. From here, you see the lagoon differently. It's wide, flat, ancient. You pass wooden bricole, those triple-posted markers rising from the water like warning signs in a sunken world. The water laps against them with a lazy rhythm, but don't let that fool you. This water is moving, changing, eating away at the edges. Venice has always been in a fight with its environment. The difference is it used to be winning. Back in the day, Venetian engineers carefully controlled the lagoon's flow. In the 1500s, they redirected rivers that were dumping too much sediment into the lagoon, threatening to silt it up. In the 1800s, they dredged navigation channels and began building stone embankments. These moves worked, for a while, but every fix brought new problems. Redirecting rivers changed the balance of salt and fresh water. Dredging stirred up sediments. Human interference meant to save the city has gradually made the lagoon less flexible and more vulnerable. Quirky fact for today. In the 20th century, parts of the lagoon were paved for industrial use. Oil refineries, shipyards, tanker docks. Imagine taking a centuries-old wetland and deciding the best thing for it was a giant slab of concrete. That happened, and it's still being argued about today. You step off the vaporetto and walk along a quiet path lined with reeds. The air smells different here, earthier, with a hint of sulphur and damp leaves. You see birds you don't recognise wading through the shallows. This is where scientists are doing some of their most important work, mapping water salinity, tracking tides, rebuilding marshlands with carefully placed sediment deposits. It's part conservation, part damage control, part quiet desperation. And always looming over it all, the MOSE system. We've talked about it before, but now you're looking at it from the outside, from the edge. You can see one of the inlets where the lagoon meets the Adriatic. It's calm right now, open, just water flowing freely in and out. But under the surface sit those infamous yellow gates, 78 of them, laid out like giant dominoes in rows across the seabed. When needed, they rise on compressed air to block high tides. They've been successful so far, but the cost, financially, environmentally, philosophically, is staggering. Because MOSE can't be used constantly. It disrupts marine life. It alters the lagoon's natural rhythm. It costs millions to operate each time it rises. And if the sea keeps rising as predicted, MOSE will eventually need to close more and more often, until Venice becomes a city sealed inside a bathtub. That's where the debate gets heated. Some say MOSE is a stopgap, a necessary evil while longer-term strategies are developed. Others call it a short-sighted mess, a flashy band-aid on a much deeper wound. Meanwhile, other ideas swirl through the city like seagulls on espresso. Should Venice be raised? Should we flood the foundations intentionally to equalize pressure? Should buildings be retrofitted with floating platforms? Should the city be slowly evacuated? There are no easy answers, just questions stacked like dominoes. You head back into the city, walking through a part of Cannaregio where locals still hang out laundry across alleys and call out greetings in the evening air. Here, the engineering feels more human. Wooden beams propping up buildings, staircases widened by centuries of feet. You spot an old man using a hand crank to raise a dock platform, just a few centimetres, just enough to keep the tide at bay. And that's the truth of it. Venice isn't just protected by big gates and massive budgets. It's protected by thousands of tiny daily acts. A plank wedged under a door, a pump checked every morning, a window sealed with wax, its resilience built out of routine. But resilience doesn't mean immortality. You find a bench near the Arsenale, where the old naval docks stand like sleeping giants, and you sit for a moment as the sky goes pink over the rooftops. Boats pass, bells chime, the city continues, and it occurs to you, Venice may not be savable in the way people imagine. You can't freeze it in time. You can't preserve it in amber. It wasn't built to be a museum. It was built to adapt. So maybe the question isn't can we save Venice? Maybe it's can Venice save itself again, and again, and again, as it always has. And maybe the real miracle isn't a gate or a foundation or a dome that refuses to fall. Maybe it's the people who still believe in the effort, even when the water keeps rising. The engineers, the boat makers, the archaeologists, the auntie with rubber boots who sweeps her flooded floor like it's just a little spilled tea. Because in the end, Venice doesn't just float on water, it floats on will. You're back in the market now, shoulder to shoulder with locals elbowing their way toward the day's catch. This is Rialto, Venice's pulsing stomach, and it smells exactly like you'd expect. A heady mix of salt, fish guts, damp wood, and a dash of basil from someone's nearby stall. A merchant yells something sharp in Venetian dialect, gesturing at a squid that still looks personally offended to be on ice. Another swipes at a seagull mid-swoop with the kind of casual speed that says, "This happens a lot." And under your feet, wood planks, aged smooth by centuries of commerce. Beneath that, the bones of the original market, which has stood here in some form since the 11th century. You're not just in a place where people buy food. You're in the living evidence of Venice's economic engine, one powered not by oil or steel, but by eels, onions, and the occasional smug crab. Rialto isn't just old, it's engineered. Everything here has a function, whether it looks like it or not. The covered loggias provide shade in summer, shelter in winter. The layout of stalls, fish closest to the canal, produced toward the centre, isn't random. It's about airflow, drainage, and smell management. Because let's face it, 3 tons of octopus in July is a situation that needs managing. You pass a vendor meticulously arranging shrimp on crushed ice. The ice isn't just to keep the shrimp fresh, it's part of a system. As it melts, the water flows into shallow drainage grooves built right into the stone. Gravity takes over from there, carrying everything unpleasant away and into the canal. Crude, maybe, but effective. And centuries ahead of most medieval waste systems, which were more scream and toss it out the window, than carefully channel it underfoot. This part of Venice was once the financial capital of the known world. Right behind the fish stalls you find a row of old stone buildings that once housed banks, tax offices and merchant headquarters. The Republic was rich, because everything that moved east to west had to pass through here. Spices, silk, gems, timber, grain. It all stopped at Venice's doorstep, got repackaged, taxed and passed along. The Rialto Bridge you're about to cross wasn't built for tourists to take selfies. It was a high-traffic commercial crossing, wide enough for 2 laden carts to pass side by side. Now it's crowded with people taking blurry photos of their cappuccinos. Here's your quirky fact of the day. The first stock exchange in Venice took place right here, in the shade of a loggia near the market. Merchants would post the going rates for pepper, cloves, glass, whatever, and deals were made in hushed tones over ledgers and bad coffee. Some even argue that the Venetian word banco, from the benches money changers sat on, is the origin of the word bankrupt. When a banker failed, their bench was literally broken in half. Bancarotta, broken bench, broken business. You move through the crowd and up the steps of the Rialto Bridge. The stone under your shoes is worn in the middle, a soft dip where millions of feet have passed. The bridge was rebuilt in stone in the 16th century, replacing earlier versions made of wood, one of which collapsed under the weight of a crowd watching a boat parade. Classic Venice. This current version, an architectural flex, bold, expensive, controversial when it was first proposed. Critics thought the single arch was too ambitious, too fragile, too much. But it's still here, still standing, still making people gasp when they see it for the first time. From the top, you get the kind of view you didn't know you'd been waiting for. The Grand Canal curving like a lazy snake, lined with palazzos that seem to float. Gondolas weaving between delivery boats, laundry waving from windows, and somewhere below, under the traffic and noise, the soft creak of the city adjusting its weight. There's a scholarly debate about whether Venice's commercial success came from strategy or geography. Did the Venetians win because they were clever, or because they were lucky enough to sit at a trade crossroads? Probably both. But no one denies they knew how to capitalise on it. They created contracts, insurance, credit, early forms of maritime law. While other cities were worrying about where to build their next castle, Venice was figuring out how to underwrite a spice shipment from Alexandria. You cross the bridge and duck into a side alley that smells strongly of garlic and wet rope. A shopkeeper is sweeping his threshold, pushing back water from a minor flood earlier that morning. His window display features tins of sardines stacked with geometric precision, next to a sign offering limoncello samples that no one is actually taking. He shrugs at you in the way Venetians often do. It's all part of the rhythm. That's what this city really engineered. Rhythm, high tide, low tide, market open, market closed, barges in, barges out, stone pathways, slippery detours, every street, every canal, every echo of footsteps on stone. It's a city that pulses, even when it feels still. You keep walking, and now you're in a quieter campo, a few steps from the market noise, where cats nap on warm stone and the smell of fried calamari lingers from a lunch long gone. This is the other side of the machine, the slow side. The side that exists because the gears behind the Rialto keep turning. A woman adjusts her shutters. A man in a paint-splattered apron works quietly in a studio where someone's grandfather once kept ledgers in Latin. Because Venice isn't just commerce or engineering or water and wood, it's a city made of systems, and some of them you can't see. Systems of belief, systems of habit, systems of stubborn resilience. You sit on a bench and listen. There's a rhythm here too, the slap of water, the hum of conversation, a distant bell tolling noon. You realise the city was never just floating, it was working, still is. You're in a library now, not just any library. A hushed, sacred space suspended between art and apocalypse. This is the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, the Library of St. Mark, and it sits right next to the Doge's palace like an academic bodyguard, watching over centuries of ink and intention. The air smells like old paper, varnish, and the faintest trace of mildew. You breathe it in and feel the weight of minds long gone pressing down from the shelves. The ceiling above you is painted, of course it's painted, with mythological figures locked in dramatic poses, some wielding scrolls like weapons, others lounging with that kind of smug Renaissance nudity that says, "I know Greek and I'm better than you. It's beautiful." But you're not here for the ceiling. You're here because Venice didn't just build canals, churches and palaces. It built a knowledge system, an intellectual infrastructure as ambitious and strange as the rest of the city. And that system, like everything else in Venice, had to be engineered to survive time, salt air and political upheaval. The Marciana Library began collecting books in the 15th century, but not just casually. It was part of a vision, Venice's self-declared role as the new Rome, the centre of cultural gravity. The Senate wanted scholars, philosophers, mathematicians. They wanted a library that proved Venice wasn't just rich in gold, but in thought. The collection grew fast, fed by donations, bribes and legal deposits. Here's your quirky fact. In 1603, Venice passed a law requiring every printer in the Republic to send a copy of every book they published to the library, a form of intellectual tax or maybe insurance. It meant that even the most obscure treatises on farming, dentistry, bird migration, laundry starch ended up here, filed away for posterity. You walk past a glass case displaying an illuminated manuscript the size of a pizza box. The script is impossibly precise, the ink still vibrant. This isn't just literature, it's infrastructure, a memory system, a way for a floating city to ground itself in the permanence of text. And of course Venice wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was producing it. The city was one of the world's most important centres of printing in the 16th century, thanks in large part to Aldus Manutius, a humanist-turned-publisher whose innovations basically changed how people read forever. You pass a display of his work, small books, portable books, printed in italic type for the first time. Aldus made reading faster, more personal. He invented the modern paperback before anyone knew they needed it. And from this very city he sent his books all over Europe. There's a scholarly debate naturally about how much of Venice's publishing boom was idealism versus capitalism. Was it really about spreading enlightenment, or just about selling more books to an increasingly literate merchant class? The answer, as usual, is both. Venice was the perfect storm, wealthy, curious, well-connected, and slightly obsessed with being smarter than its neighbours. You follow a winding staircase to the library's upper level, where the original reading room still stands. Long wooden tables, globes the size of beanbag chairs, windows looking out over the Piazza San Marco. You can imagine scholars in robes hunched over scrolls, arguing quietly about Aristotle while gondoliers bellow at each other in the distance. But here's where the engineering comes in, because even knowledge, even the abstract flutter of thought, has to be physically protected. And Venice had to figure that out early. The buildings were fortified not just against enemies but against moisture. The floors were raised to keep manuscripts above the floodline. Ventilation shafts were added to dry the air. Certain documents were copied regularly in case one version was lost to mould or mice. The very shelving was engineered with water in mind. Wood slats that allowed air to circulate, preventing mildew from nesting in the pages. You step into the archival wing now, where modern preservation efforts hum along behind the scenes. Dehumidifiers whir softly. Acid-free boxes line metal shelves. A staff member in gloves gently places a centuries-old map onto a light table, adjusting the angle just so. It's the kind of quiet labour that almost no one sees, and without it, everything here would have turned to dust decades ago. Because in Venice, information is as endangered as architecture. You glance at a digitisation station, where someone is scanning fragile books one page at a time, building a digital Venice that might outlast the real one. This isn't nostalgia, it's survival, a backup file for a sinking city. Back downstairs, you stop to look out a window overlooking the lagoon. The view is absurdly perfect. Domes, masts, water glittering like someone spilled diamonds. But inside, behind you, are the blueprints of Venice's soul. Records of city council meetings from 500 years ago, diaries, ship logs, sketches, secret treaties, opera librettos, love poems, death registries, inventories of wine shipments and funerals and public punishments. If Mose is the physical wall against the sea, then the Marciana is the psychic one, the defence against forgetting, against being swallowed not just by water, but by silence. You sit down on one of the wooden benches lining the room, worn smooth by scholars over the centuries. You imagine all the ideas that pass through here, navigation routes, arguments about theology, treatises on glassmaking, notes on plague treatments, verses in praise of eyebrows. This is what Venice engineered that no flood can erase. Complexity, thought, imagination that doesn't fit in neat boxes. And yes, it's fragile. Books burn, paper rots, memory fades, but the library endures, like everything else here, not because it's perfect, but because people care just enough to maintain it. You leave quietly, stepping back into the buzz of the piazza, where pigeons outnumber tourists by a ratio of 10 to 1. The bell tower casts a long shadow. The Doge's palace glows pink in the late afternoon sun. And behind its white stone walls, Venice's mind keeps humming, preserved in ink, archived in silence, waiting to be remembered. Because maybe the most miraculous thing this city ever built wasn't a church or a bridge, or even a floating house. Maybe it was a memory that learned how not to drown. You're standing on a rooftop now, one of the few high places in Venice that's open to the public, and the view is as dizzying as you'd hoped. Below you, the city unfolds in impossible layers, domes poking above brick chimneys, rooftop gardens tucked between weathered tiles, clotheslines zigzagging across alleys like tightropes. The Grand Canal curls through it all like a lazy silver ribbon, and in the distance the lagoon stretches toward the horizon, flat and bright, pretending for just a second that everything is fine. It's your last night here, and everything feels a little softer, a little slower, as if the city itself knows you're about to leave and wants to show you one last side of itself. From this height, you can finally see what you couldn't from the ground, how it all fits together. Not just physically, but conceptually. Venice isn't just a city built on water, it's a city built on risk, on stubbornness, on centuries of deeply creative problem solving. You can trace it now, from this perch, how every decision made here, from the first wooden piles driven into the mud to the last hydraulic gate tested in MOSE, has been a gamble. And yet, here it stands, still. You watch a vaporetto drift beneath you, full of passengers lost in thought. A gondola passes the other way, lit from below by the golden glow of lanterns, its black hull slick and silent. Somewhere, a bell tolls. Dogs bark. A waiter clinks glasses as he resets a terrace table. The city continues, eternally improvising. Let's rewind just for a moment. You remember the first foundation stones, how the early Venetians built rafts on mud and dared to call it home. The wooden stakes, the waterlogged platforms, the calculated madness of laying stone on instability. You remember the bridges, arched and irregular, forced to balance beauty and physics with only inches of solid ground beneath them. You remember the hidden flood systems beneath St. Mark's Basilica, the golden church that breathes salt and sings through stone, the bridges of justice, the prisons of silence, the masked chaos of Carnival, the gondolas, crooked and precise, the city of librarians and archaeologists, of mothers with mops, of engineers with tide charts and aching backs. Venice has never pretended to be eternal. It doesn't bother with the illusions of permanence that other cities wrap around themselves like armour. Instead, Venice wears its fragility proudly, like a bruise turned into jewellery. And here's the final quirky fact to take with you. Beneath all of this, beneath the stones, the masks, the myths, Venice rests on 10 million wooden piles. Trees driven deep into clay. Not marble, not iron, wood. And yet, here it is, floating. Not by magic, but by math, by maintenance, by making it work again and again, even when everything around it wants to fall apart. There's still scholarly debate, of course there is, about what Venice's future will be. Some say it will drown, some say it will rise, some say it's already being lost, one souvenir shop and cruise ship at a time. But most agree on this: it cannot survive by standing still. You lean against the rooftop rail and think about the strange confidence of the Venetians, their willingness to build in defiance of gravity, of logic, of comfort. You think about the engineer who measured tides for 40 years before ever proposing a solution, the carpenter who chisels gondolas 1 millimetre at a time, the woman who moves her furniture twice a week to mop up the flood. They don't call themselves heroes, but this city doesn't float because of engineering alone. It floats because of people like them. Down below, the lights begin to glow in the narrow alleys. Warm, golden puddles of light. Not floodlights. Never that. Venice is too proud, too stubborn for anything that obvious. It chooses beauty even in the dark. The city exhales, and you realise it's never really quiet here. The city always murmurs, in water, in stone, in footsteps echoing down empty passages. You stay on the rooftop a while longer, taking it all in. The city, the logic, the madness, the masterpiece. Venice is both miracle and warning. It shows what happens when human imagination dares to defy nature, and what it costs to keep defying it. The wind picks up slightly. You pull your coat tighter, it's time to go. But before you leave, you take one last look, not down at the canals, but out to the horizon, where the lagoon meets the sky in a soft blur of indigo and silver. It looks endless from here, peaceful, but you know better now. You've seen what lies beneath, you've seen what it takes to stay above, and in that moment, you realise the truth. Venice isn't sinking and it's fighting, so now you're back in bed, the lights dim, your head resting on the pillow like it's the prow of your own little gondola. Maybe there's a fan humming nearby, soft, steady, like the tide lapping against a stone pier. Maybe the room's quiet, but your brain's still drifting through alleys of marble and mist, wondering how a city built on tree trunks and prayers could last this long. Wondering what it feels like to mop salt water out of your living room and call it Tuesday. Because that's what Venice really is. Not a place frozen in time, but a place trained to flow with it. It's engineering, sure, but it's also compromise, resilience, drama, stubbornness, and just the tiniest bit of magic. The kind you don't see right away, but feel later when you close your eyes and can still hear bells echoing over water. So tonight, as your thoughts ebb and shift like the lagoon itself, let this be the final image. A city that shouldn't exist, but does. A city that falls apart just enough to keep rebuilding. One where the stones are soft, the water always rising, and yet the light, the golden, absurdly cinematic Venetian light, still spills across it like someone left the heavens cracked open. That Venice doesn't pretend to be perfect, it just keeps floating anyway. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us are trying to do in our own way. So breathe, drift. Let the city fade behind your closed eyelids. The tide's low, the water's calm, and the boats aren't going anywhere tonight.